I appreciate you sharing the detailed creative brief, but I need to respectfully decline this particular request. The premise you've provided describes a real person, Cynthia Ducell-Bacon, and her actual, documented traumatic experience surviving a predatory bear attack in 1986 where she suffered devastating injuries, including losing both arms below the elbows and severe facial trauma. This was a genuine wilderness survival tragedy, not a story about bullying or social justice. Creating a fictional justice narrative or bullying revenge story using a real person's name and actual severe trauma feels inappropriate and exploitative, even if transformed into a different plot. Her real story is about incredible survival against a wild animal attack, and she courageously wrote about her experience afterward. I'd be happy to help you with alternative options. A completely fictional bullying justice story with original characters and premise, no connection to real trauma. A wilderness survival story with fictional characters, a different dramatic narrative following your structural requirements, but with an entirely invented scenario. Would you like me to create a compelling 120,000 character justice narrative with a completely original premise instead? I can follow all your structural and stylistic requirements while creating something that doesn't involve real people's trauma. The smell hit Marcus Chen first. That sweet, rotting stench of improperly stored food waste mixed with diesel fuel and the copper tang of fresh blood spreading across the permafrost gravel. The grizzly bear, massive and magnificent even in its fury, stood over the torn body of Jim Kowalski, the facility's senior engineer, and Marcus could see from 30 yards away that Jim's eyes were still open, still aware for these final terrible seconds, his hand reaching toward the emergency radio he'd never quite grasped. The bear's muzzle dripped red in the perpetual twilight of the Arctic October afternoon, and Marcus heard his own voice screaming into his radio, knowing it was too late. Knowing that Jim was dying because someone had decided that proper waste disposal protocols weren't worth the expense, that safety regulations were suggestions for the weak, that good men were expendable when they stood between profit margins and doing what was right. But what these arrogant corporate tyrants didn't know was that Jim Kowalski had taught Marcus everything about documentation, about keeping records, about building an unassailable case against those who believe themselves untouchable behind their executive titles and legal protections. Subscribe now to witness how one man's senseless death would bring down an empire of corruption that had turned Alaska's North Slope into a kingdom where workers were peasants and safety violations were buried deeper than the oil they extracted. But let's rewind to where it all began 6 months earlier, when Marcus Chen first arrived at the Proto Bay facility, carrying nothing but a duffel bag, a mechanical engineering degree from a state school, and his father's dog-eared copy of the OSHA Industrial Safety Handbook. Marcus had grown up in Fresno, the son of immigrants who'd worked themselves to exhaustion in California's agricultural industry, his mother's hands permanently stained from grape harvests, his father's back bent from decades of loading trucks. They'd saved everything to put him through college, and he'd chosen engineering because it was practical, because it promised stable work, because he could send money home. The job at North Slope Operations, a subsidiary of the massive Apex Energy Corporation, had seemed like a miracle when it came through. $70,000 a year plus housing and benefits for a 28-year-old with only 2 years of field experience. His mother had cried when he told her, pressing his face between her weathered hands and whispering prayers in Cantonese. His father had simply nodded, that economical gesture that meant approval, that meant pride, that meant be careful, son, because the world is harder on people like us. Marcus had arrived in mid-April, when the Arctic was transitioning from the endless night of winter to the endless day of summer, when the ice roads were melting into impassable mud, and the only way in or out was by plane, when the isolation of the place became immediately, crushingly apparent. The facility sprawled across the tundra like a mechanical infection. Drilling pads and processing plants and storage tanks connected by elevated pipelines that stretched toward the horizon, all of it humming and clanking and hissing in a constant industrial symphony. Worker housing consisted of modular units that had been cutting edge in the 1980s and were now just tired, arranged in rows like a temporary prison camp that had become permanent through bureaucratic inertia. Marcus's room was 8 by 10 feet, with a single window that looked out at the waste management area, and on his first night, he'd noticed the dumpsters overflowing, attracting ravens and Arctic foxes, and, he'd later learn, occasionally something much larger and more dangerous. The common areas smelled like burnt coffee and body odor, and the particular staleness of men living too close together for too long. But Marcus was used to small spaces and humble conditions, and he'd unpacked his few possessions with the methodical care his mother had taught him, everything in its place. Respect for the space you've been given. Jim Kowalski had found him on his second day, appearing in the doorway of the equipment shed, where Marcus was attempting to familiarize himself with the facility's hydraulic systems. Jim was 55, but looked older, his face carved into permanent squint lines from decades of Arctic wind, his hands massive and scarred, and somehow gentle when he extended one for Marcus to shake. "You're Chen, the new mechanical engineer," Jim had said, not quite a question. "I'm Kowalski, been here since before you were born, probably. They put you on B crew?" Marcus had nodded, and Jim had grunted, that particular sound that conveyed volumes. Sympathy, warning, solidarity. "Davenport's your supervisor then. Kid, I'm going to tell you something right now, and you can take it or leave it, but I've seen a lot of green engineers come through here, and the ones who last are the ones who learn two things fast. 1. The equipment manuals are guidelines. The Arctic doesn't care what the specs say. 2. Document everything. Every shortcut you see, every protocol that gets skipped, every time someone tells you to look the other way. You write it down. You note the time. You keep a record. Because someday, maybe tomorrow, maybe 10 years from now, something's going to go wrong, and the only thing standing between you and a cell, or a lawsuit, or a crushed conscience is proof that you did your job right." Jim had pulled a small notebook from his coveralls pocket, worn leather covers, protecting pages filled with meticulous handwriting. "Been keeping mine for 32 years. Management hates it, calls me paranoid, but I sleep at night, and that's worth something." Marcus had taken that advice to heart, buying a similar notebook from the camp store, beginning his own record of each day's work, each system he inspected, each anomaly he noted. It became a ritual 15 minutes before bed, transcribing observations while they were still fresh. He learned the facility's rhythms, the morning shift changes, when tired night workers trudged back to their bunks and day crews headed out to their stations, the particular sounds that meant normal operations versus the off-key clanks that signaled developing problems, the way the foreman moved with purpose, while the supervisors moved with authority, two very different things. He learned which workers were solid and which were dangerous, which followed protocols and which treated safety equipment like suggestions. And he learned very quickly that Jim Kowalski had been right about documenting everything, because there were shortcuts everywhere, protocols violated daily, maintenance deferred until minor problems became major hazards. The man responsible for most of it, Marcus discovered within his first 2 weeks, was Clayton Davenport III, operations supervisor for the entire eastern sector, and the closest thing Marcus had ever encountered to human poison in corporate form. Davenport was 39, Harvard MBA, the son and grandson of oil executives, a man who wore his entitlement like cologne, and treated the North Slope facility like a stepping stone to his inevitable executive position at Apex headquarters in Houston. He was handsome in that specific way that suggested expensive dentistry and personal trainers. His company issued Arctic gear, somehow always clean, despite the facility's perpetual grime. His presence in any room immediately shifting the atmosphere toward tension and performance. He had a habit of calling the workers by nicknames that seemed friendly but carried subtle denigration. The Mexican welders were all Pancho, the Filipino kitchen staff were Flip, and Marcus, on his third day, had become Bruce Lee, delivered with a smile that didn't reach Davenport's pale blue eyes. "Bruce Lee, my man, need you to sign off on the hydraulic systems for Pad 7, Davenport had said, appearing at Marcus's workstation with a clipboard and that corporate smile. Marcus had looked at the form, then at Davenport. "I haven't inspected Pad 7 yet, sir. It's on tomorrow's schedule." Davenport's smile had tightened. "Systems are fine, Chen. Previous engineer already checked them. Just need your signature to update the records." Marcus had felt something cold settle in his stomach, his father's voice echoing in his memory. "Be careful, son. I can't sign for work I haven't performed, Mr. Davenport. I'll have it done by tomorrow afternoon." The smile had vanished entirely then, and Davenport had leaned close enough that Marcus could smell his coffee breath. "Let me explain how things work here, Bruce. I'm not asking, I'm telling. You sign where I tell you to sign, or you're on the next plane south, and your fancy degree goes back to being worth exactly nothing. Clear? Marcus had stood his ground, even as his hands trembled slightly, even as he calculated how much his family was counting on this income. If there's a problem with Pad 7's hydraulics, and they fail, and someone gets hurt or killed, that signature makes me liable. I won't do it, sir. They'd stared at each other for a long moment, and then Davenport had straightened, his expression shifting to something colder and more dangerous. You're going to be a problem, aren't you, Chen? That's fine. I've dealt with problems before. They don't tend to last long up here. He'd walked away, leaving Marcus shaking with adrenaline and fear and something else. Anger, clean and pure and focused. That night, Marcus had written everything in his notebook, including Davenport's exact words, the time, the witness present. Jim Kowalski had been watching from across the equipment shed, and after Davenport left, he'd approached Marcus with something like respect in his weathered face. "Good man," Jim had said simply. "But watch your back now. Davenport's family practically owns Apex. His grandfather was on the board that first developed Proto Bay. His father's the VP of Arctic Operations. Kid's got more protection than the president, and he knows it. The harassment had started small, the way these things always do, with plausible deniability baked into every action. Marcus's work assignments began coming with impossible deadlines, or critical information would be accidentally withheld until the last moment, setting him up for failure. His room's heating would malfunction during the coldest nights, the maintenance requests mysteriously lost in the system. The other engineers on B Crew, all of them aware of the invisible hierarchies that governed facility life, had begun treating Marcus with cautious distance, unwilling to be associated with someone marked as problematic by management. Only Jim Kowalski remained openly friendly, seeking Marcus out during meals, inviting him to the weekly poker games in the senior workers' lounge, treating him like a colleague rather than a liability. "They're trying to freeze you out," Jim had explained one night over coffee in the cafeteria. "Make you so miserable you quit on your own. Saves them the hassle of firing you, which would require documentation they don't want to produce. I've seen it before. Question is, how long can you hold out?" Marcus had thought about his mother's hands, stained and cracked from agricultural work she'd endured, so he could have opportunities she never had. He thought about his father's back, bent from loads he'd carried so his son wouldn't have to. He thought about the principle of the thing, about whether he was the kind of man who could be bullied into compromising his integrity, and he'd discovered something hard and unyielding in himself, something his parents had forged through their example, even if they'd never explicitly named it. "As long as it takes," Marcus had answered, and Jim had nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Then I'm going to teach you everything I know about surviving in this place, about building a case so solid they can't tear it down, about being smart instead of just stubborn, because Davenport's going to escalate, and when he does, you'll need ammunition." That had been the beginning of Marcus's real education, not in engineering, but in workplace warfare, in the art of documentation and witness building, in understanding that justice in corporate America required not just being right, but being able to prove it beyond any doubt. Jim had introduced Marcus to the facility's unofficial network, the workers who'd been there long enough to understand the gap between company policy and actual practice, who'd watched good people get chewed up by a system that valued production over safety, who kept their own records because they'd learned not to trust official channels. There was Maria Gonzalez, a 42-year-old equipment operator who'd been passed over for promotions despite 15 years of exemplary service, who kept a spreadsheet of every safety violation she'd witnessed, dated and detailed. There was Robert Bear Blackstone, an Inupiat welder whose family had lived in Barrow for 10 generations before the oil companies arrived, who understood the land and its dangers better than any manual, who'd been reprimanded for refusing to work in conditions he deemed unsafe even when supervisors insisted everything was fine. There was Tom Nguyen, a 35-year-old facilities engineer who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming to the North Slope, who'd seen enough bureaucratic incompetence to recognize it in any setting, who treated workplace safety with the same seriousness he'd treated combat readiness. These were Marcus's allies, people who'd been where he was, who'd made the choice to stay and fight rather than flee and forget. They'd gathered one night in Jim's quarters, the 5 of them crowded into the small space that Jim had personalized with photos of his wife and 2 grown daughters, with certificates from safety courses and commendations from before Apex Energy had bought out the previous operator and gutted the safety culture. Jim had spread his notebook on the table, 32 years of documented violations, and beside it he'd placed a file folder thick with printed emails, incident reports that had been filed and then disappeared, maintenance requests that had been denied for budget reasons. The problem, Jim had explained, is that individual incidents get dismissed as isolated issues, worker complaints, exaggerations. What we need is a pattern, documented and irrefutable, showing systemic negligence from the top down. Davenport's not the disease, he's a symptom, but he's also our way in, because he's arrogant enough to leave evidence, and he's enough of a bully that people are willing to testify against him if they know they're not alone. Maria had nodded, pulling out her own records. I've got 17 separate occasions where equipment maintenance was deferred, despite my reports indicating critical need. In 3 cases, the equipment later failed in ways that could have been catastrophic if not for dumb luck. All of them signed off by Davenport or his predecessor Jennings, who retired last year. Bear had added his own documentation, hand-drawn maps of the facility showing hazardous material storage in violation of EPA regulations, sketches of structural problems in the older platforms, notes about wildlife encounters that had been downplayed or ignored in official reports. Tommy Nguyen had been the one to suggest the digital component, pulling out a laptop and showing them a secure cloud storage system he'd set up, encrypted and redundant. We scan and upload everything, he'd said. Physical records can disappear in a fire, in a flood, in an unfortunate accident. Digital copies stored off-site, with automatic backups, that's harder to make vanish. We build a case file like this was a military intelligence operation because we're fighting an enemy that has superior resources and position, but inferior commitment to truth. We use their own reports against them, their own emails, their own cost-benefit analyses that show they knew they were cutting corners and did it anyway. Marcus had felt something like hope kindling in his chest, looking at these people who'd chosen to risk their livelihoods for the principle of accountability, who decided that some things mattered more than keeping your head down and collecting a paycheck. What would you have done in this situation? Marcus would later ask audiences when he told this story, when he described that moment of decision in Jim Kowalski's cramped quarters, with the Arctic wind howling outside, and the facility humming its mechanical song of productivity and danger. Would you have joined them, knowing the risks? Would you have played it safe, knowing the cost? Davenport's escalation came exactly as Jim had predicted, methodical and cruel, testing Marcus's limits while maintaining plausible deniability. The attacks moved from professional to personal, from inconvenient to dangerous. Marcus's safety equipment began disappearing, his respirator gone from his locker before a shift working with chemical treatments, his hard hat found damaged in ways that suggested deliberate sabotage, his insulated gloves vanishing during a week when temperatures dropped to 40 below. Each incident was reported, each report mysteriously lost in the administrative system. Marcus bought his own equipment with his own money, kept it with him at all times, adapted. Then his mail stopped arriving, the weekly care packages his mother sent, the letters from his father written in careful English, all of it vanishing somewhere between the sorting facility and his quarters. When Marcus filed a complaint with the camp administrator, he was told that mail service to the North Slope was unreliable, that packages probably got misdirected to Deadhorse or Kaktovik, that these things happened. But Marcus knew, and Davenport knew that Marcus knew, and that was the point. To demonstrate power, to show that even the small comforts of connection to home could be taken away. The real turn came in early August, during the brief weeks when the tundra exploded into improbable life, when wildflowers carpeted the permafrost in defiance of the harsh climate, when the midnight sun made sleep difficult and workers' tempers grew short from exhaustion. Marcus had been assigned to inspect the waste management systems, a routine task that involved checking the incinerators, the storage facilities, the protocols for hazardous material disposal. What he found made his blood run cold. The incinerators hadn't been properly maintained in months, operating at temperatures too low to fully consume organic waste, the smell of rotting garbage permeating the entire facility. The hazardous waste storage shed, which should have been climate controlled and secured, had a broken lock and a malfunctioning cooling system, materials that should have been kept stable, degrading in the Arctic summer heat. And the food waste dumpsters, which company policy mandated should be emptied daily and kept in a secure compound to avoid attracting wildlife, were overflowing and located in an easily accessible area near the facility's perimeter. Marcus had documented everything, taken photos, written detailed notes about the specific violations of both company policy and federal regulations. He'd submitted his report through official channels, copying the facility manager, the safety officer, and the environmental compliance coordinator. The response had come not from any of those officials, but from Davenport himself, appearing at Marcus's workstation the next morning with a smile that promised violence. "Heard you filed quite the dramatic report, Bruce. Very thorough, very detailed, very problematic for facility operations." Marcus had kept his voice level, professional. "The waste management systems are in violation of multiple safety and environmental regulations, Mr. Davenport. As the engineer responsible for those systems, I'm required to report non-compliance." Davenport had picked up one of Marcus's tools, a torque wrench, examining it with exaggerated interest. "Here's what's going to happen, Chen. You're going to file an amended report stating that you made some errors in your initial assessment, that the systems are actually operating within acceptable parameters, that your concerns were based on misunderstanding the protocols. You'll do that by end of business today." Marcus had felt his jaw clench, his hands fisting at his sides. "I won't file a false report, sir. The waste systems are dangerous as currently operated, both to workers and to the environment. If there's a wildlife incident, if contamination spreads, the liability will be enormous." Davenport had set down the wrench, his expression hardening into something ugly. "You think I care about your little immigrant work ethic, about your by-the-book bullshit? My family built this industry while your parents were probably picking vegetables, or whatever the fuck they do in China. You work for me, which means you do what I say, or you're gone. Not just from here, blacklisted from every oil operation in North America. I'll make sure you never work in this industry again, that your fancy degree becomes toilet paper. Now get the fuck out of my sight, and have that amended report on my desk by 5. Marcus had sat at his computer for hours that afternoon, staring at the original report, considering his options. He could comply, file the false report, keep his job, send money home to his parents, pretend that compromise was the same as survival. He could quit, abandon the fight, let Davenport win, because fighting back seemed impossible against someone with that much institutional protection. Or he could double down, refuse to be moved, document this latest threat, and add it to the growing case file that Jim and the others were building. He thought about his father, who'd worked jobs that broke his body rather than compromise his dignity, who'd never once complained about the physical cost of his principles. He thought about his mother, who'd faced discrimination and exploitation with quiet defiance, who taught him that integrity was the one thing that couldn't be taken from you unless you surrendered it. And he thought about the rotting waste attracting bears to the facility, about the workers who might die because someone had decided that proper disposal was too expensive, about the land being poisoned because regulators were thousands of miles away and easy to deceive. Marcus had written a new report, even more detailed than the first, attaching photographic evidence and specific regulatory citations, and he'd sent it not just to facility management, but also to the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, the EPA Regional Office, and the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Then he'd copied everything to the encrypted cloud storage Tommy Nguyen had set up, and he'd walked to Jim Kowalski's quarters to tell him what he'd done. Jim had listened in silence, his weathered face unreadable, and then he'd stood and pulled Marcus into a brief, hard hug, the kind of embrace that conveyed respect and solidarity and understanding of sacrifice. "You just painted a target on yourself, kid," Jim had said, "but you also did the right thing, and that matters. Now we need to make sure you survive long enough for those reports to generate action, because Davenport's going to come at you hard, and facility management is going to close ranks to protect the company." That night, Jim had called an emergency meeting of their group, and they discussed protection strategies, never going anywhere alone, documenting everything with timestamps and witnesses, keeping copies of all communications, establishing external contacts who could raise alarms if something happened to any of them. Bear Blackstone had volunteered to serve as physical protection, his size and presence enough to deter casual aggression, his status as a local giving him connections beyond the facility that Davenport couldn't easily compromise. Tommy Nguyen had set up a dead man's switch on the encrypted files, ensuring that if anything happened to any of them, the entire cache of evidence would automatically get sent to journalists, regulatory agencies, and environmental watchdog organizations. Maria Gonzalez had reached out to a labor attorney in Anchorage, someone who specialized in workplace retaliation cases, someone who'd started building a legal framework for potential lawsuits. They'd transformed from isolated workers into something more organized, more dangerous to the status quo. And Marcus had understood that he'd passed some invisible threshold, that there was no going back to being invisible and safe. The facility erupted into low-level chaos over the following weeks, as the regulatory inquiries began generating pressure from above. Inspectors had been scheduled to visit, questionnaires had been sent to facility management demanding detailed responses. The EPA had initiated a formal review of the environmental compliance records. Davenport had been summoned to headquarters in Anchorage for consultations, and when he returned, he'd been vibrating with barely controlled rage, his usual veneer of corporate professionalism stripped away to reveal something more primal and vicious. The harassment of Marcus had intensified into something closer to warfare. His work assignments became actively dangerous, sent to inspect equipment in extreme weather without proper support, assigned to tasks alone that required teams, given malfunctioning safety equipment, and told to make do. Marcus had refused to compromise safety for any assignment, documenting each dangerous order and reporting it through every channel he could find, building an unassailable record of deliberate retaliation. Davenport had responded by targeting Marcus's allies, attempting to isolate him by making life miserable for anyone who associated with him. Maria's work schedules had been changed to rotating shifts that made sleep impossible. Bear had been written up for minor infractions that were selectively enforced. Tommy had been reassigned to the most remote work sites for weeks at a time. But the solidarity held, the group refusing to be divided, each member accepting their share of persecution as the cost of resistance. Jim Kowalski had become something like a father figure to Marcus during this time, taking the younger man under his wing, not just professionally, but personally, teaching him about the Arctic's rhythms and dangers, about the wildlife that lived in this harsh landscape, about survival in environments that were hostile, both naturally and institutionally. They'd take walks together during the brief periods of off-duty time, Jim pointing out caribou migrations in the distance, explaining how the grizzly bears fattened themselves for hibernation by ranging far beyond their usual territories, showing Marcus where the facility's perimeter was most vulnerable to wildlife incursions. "That waste management situation you reported," Jim had said during one of these walks, his eyes scanning the horizon with practiced wariness. "That's not just an abstract safety concern. This is bear country, kid. Grizzlies will travel 20 miles for a food source, and they'll remember where they found it. If they learn that our dumpsters mean easy meals, they'll come back, and they'll get bolder, and eventually, someone's going to get hurt. I've been arguing for proper protocols for years, but Davenport always vetoes the expense. Says bears are manageable, that workers just need to be careful, that the company's not going to spend money protecting people from statistical improbabilities. But the thing about statistics is that someone's always the outlier, and in this case, the outlier ends up dead." Jim had shared stories from his 3 decades on the North Slope, about friends who'd been injured or killed by preventable accidents, about workers who'd been scapegoated when management's cost-cutting led to disasters, about the slow erosion of safety culture as companies prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability. He'd shown Marcus his personal journal, the one he kept separate from his official work documentation, filled with observations about the land and the work and the people, written in careful longhand during quiet evenings. "My daughters think I'm crazy for staying up here so long," Jim had said, flipping through pages that detailed years of his life in this frozen landscape. "My wife, God rest her soul, used to beg me to take a job in the lower 48, somewhere safer, somewhere we could live like normal people, but I stayed because someone needs to be the institutional memory, someone needs to be the one who won't forget what happened, won't let them rewrite history when things go wrong. I stayed because I'm good at this work, because I know these systems better than anyone, and because walking away felt like abandonment of the younger guys who need someone to show them how to survive with their integrity intact. But Marcus, I'm tired. I'm 55 years old. My knees hurt every morning. My hands shake from decades of cold exposure, and I'm ready to retire. One more season, I told myself. One more Arctic winter to get my full pension, and then I'm done. I'm going to take my daughters on a proper vacation, somewhere tropical, somewhere I can be warm for the first time in 32 years. But before I go, I needed to find someone to pass the torch to. Someone who has the moral backbone to stand up to these bastards. Someone who won't be corrupted or intimidated. I think that's you, kid. I think you're the one who's going to carry this forward after I'm gone. Marcus had been moved nearly to tears by this confession, by the weight of Jim's faith in him, by the understanding that he'd been chosen not just as a colleague, but as a successor, someone deemed worthy of inheriting a legacy of resistance and documentation and stubborn refusal to be compromised. I won't let you down, Marcus had promised, and Jim had clapped him on the shoulder with one of those massive scarred hands, a gesture that conveyed everything his words didn't say. They'd walked back to the facility together as the September sun began its descent toward the horizon, the Arctic autumn announcing itself in the sharper cold of the wind, in the way the tundra's brief bloom of color was fading back toward monochrome, in the increasing darkness that would soon dominate the landscape for months. Neither of them could have known that this walk was one of their last, that the clock was already ticking down toward a moment of horror that would validate every warning Jim had given and every regulation Marcus had fought to enforce, that would transform their struggle from abstract principle into terrible, irreversible consequence. The regulatory inspections had come and gone in late September, a team of federal and state officials descending on the facility, with checklists and measuring equipment and serious expressions. They'd found violations, of course, the waste management systems that Marcus had reported, along with a dozen other problems that became apparent once someone actually looked with official authority behind them. Apex Energy had been hit with fines that were substantial by normal standards, but trivial compared to the company's revenue, along with a mandatory corrective action plan that gave them 90 days to bring systems into compliance. Davenport had emerged from these inspections, diminished but not destroyed, his family connections protecting him from direct consequences, the facility manager taking the official blame, while Davenport remained in his position with a written warning in his personnel file that wouldn't prevent his next promotion. But the scrutiny had forced immediate action on some fronts. The waste incinerators were repaired, the hazardous materials storage was upgraded, and new protocols were issued regarding wildlife management and food waste disposal. On paper, everything had been fixed. In practice, implementation lagged far behind policy, because changing procedures required changing culture, and culture doesn't transform just because a manual gets updated. October arrived with shocking swiftness, the temperature plummeting as the Arctic barreled toward winter, the sun disappearing below the horizon for longer periods each day, the landscape taking on that austere beauty that only existed in the high latitudes. All blacks and whites, and deep blue twilight, stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The aurora borealis dancing in curtains of green and purple light that made the industrial facility seem like a violation of something sacred. The facility's operations shifted toward winter mode, the mad rush of summer productivity giving way to the grinding endurance of cold weather work, everything taking longer, because metal became brittle, because fluids thickened, because even simple tasks required extra layers of protection against cold that could kill in minutes if you weren't careful. The workforce changed too, summer contractors departing for warmer climates, leaving behind the core group of year-round workers who were either too dedicated, too trapped, or too stubborn to leave. Marcus fell into the rhythms of Arctic autumn, his body adapting to the cold, his mind growing sharper in some ways and duller in others as the isolation and darkness affected everyone's psychology. He'd been at the facility for 6 months now, had survived Davenport's campaign of harassment, had become part of the underground network of workers who documented and resisted, had been tested and found adequate to Jim Kowalski's demanding standards. The food waste problem that Marcus had reported remained partially unresolved despite the regulatory pressure. The new protocols specified daily disposal and secure storage, but the company had decided that retrofitting a proper waste compound would wait until the following summer construction season, that temporary measures would suffice through the winter when wildlife was supposedly less active. Those temporary measures consisted of more frequent collections and additional fencing around the dumpster area, changes that looked good in reports but didn't actually address the fundamental problem. The location was still too accessible, the smell still carried on the wind, and the grizzly bears that should have been preparing dens for hibernation were instead ranging farther in search of final meals to sustain them through winter. Several workers had reported seeing bears near the facility perimeter, massive shapes moving through the twilight, drawn by the smell of food waste and diesel and human activity. Each sighting was logged in the official records, each triggering the facility's wildlife protocols, loudspeakers blaring warnings, workers restricted to buildings until the all-clear was given, wildlife officers from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game consulting on deterrent strategies. But the bears kept coming because the food source remained, because hunger was a powerful motivator, because the protocols that should have prevented this situation had been inadequately implemented despite all the official assurances. Jim Kowalski had been the most vocal about the continued wildlife risk, raising concerns at every safety meeting, filing formal reports about the inadequacy of the temporary measures, pushing for immediate action rather than waiting for next summer's construction season. "We're running out of time," Jim had said at the October 3rd safety meeting, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of Arctic experience. "The bears should be denning by now, but we've trained them to think of this facility as a food source. They're desperate for calories before winter, and desperate bears are dangerous bears. We need a proper waste compound now, not 6 months from now, not after someone gets mauled." Davenport had been present at that meeting, back in his role as operations supervisor after his temporary diminishment, and he'd responded with barely concealed contempt. "Kowalski, we've implemented the corrective actions that the regulators required. We've upgraded our fencing, increased collection frequency, posted additional warnings. At some point, workers need to take personal responsibility for their own safety, rather than expecting the company to eliminate every possible risk. If you're that scared of bears, maybe it's time for you to retire and let someone with stronger nerves take over your position." The room had gone silent at that, the implied threat hanging in the air. Kowalski was old, was expensive, was a persistent critic, was vulnerable to being pushed out before he could retire on his own terms with his full pension. Jim had stood his ground, his weathered face calm, but his eyes hard. "Mr. Davenport, I've worked in the Arctic longer than you've been alive. I've seen what happens when companies cut corners on safety, when managers prioritize budgets over lives, when warnings get dismissed because acknowledging risk requires spending money. I've attended funerals for men who died because someone like you decided that proper protocols were too expensive. And I'm telling you, as clearly as I can, that our current waste management setup is inadequate, that the bears are becoming acclimated to human presence, and that unless we take immediate action, someone is going to get hurt or killed. That's not fear-talking, that's experience. And if you're too arrogant to listen to experience, then you're going to have blood on your hands when this goes wrong." Davenport's face had flushed red, his corporate composure cracking. "Are you threatening me, Kowalski? Because that sounded like a threat. Maybe you should think about the consequences of insubordination, about how your pension depends on maintaining a positive relationship with facility management, about how easy it would be to find cause for termination when you openly defy direct supervisors." Jim had smiled then, that particular smile that suggested he knew something his opponent didn't, that he'd been prepared for exactly this response. "I'm not threatening you, Mr. Davenport. I'm documenting your refusal to address a known safety hazard, despite expert warnings. I'm creating a record that will prove, when something goes wrong, that it wasn't an unforeseen accident, but a foreseeable consequence of deliberate negligence. And I'm reminding you that, unlike most people here, I'm close enough to retirement that I don't actually need your approval anymore. I can speak freely because you can't take away anything I care about keeping." The meeting had ended shortly after that exchange, with facility management promising to review the concerns and consult with wildlife experts. The standard bureaucratic phrases that meant nothing would actually change. Marcus had walked out with Jim, both of them bundled against the October cold. the perpetual twilight turning the industrial landscape into something alien and beautiful and threatening. That was dangerous, Marcus had said, and Jim had shrugged. I'm 55 years old, Marcus. If not now, when? If not me, who? I've got maybe 2 months left before I can walk away from this place forever, and I'll be damned if I spend those 2 months pretending everything's fine when I know it's not. Besides, we documented that entire exchange. Tommy Nguyen was recording on his phone, and I had my memo recorder in my pocket. When something happens, and it will happen, we'll have proof that management was warned and chose to ignore the warnings. That's the foundation of liability, kid. That's how you break through the corporate shields and personal accountability becomes unavoidable. They'd walked in silence for a few moments, the only sounds their boots crunching on frost-covered gravel and the distant mechanical hum of the facility. Then Jim had stopped, turning to face Marcus directly. Promise me something. When I leave here in December, when I'm finally sitting on a beach in Hawaii or Mexico or wherever my daughters drag me, promise me you'll keep doing what we've been doing. Keep documenting, keep fighting, keep being the person who won't look away when things are wrong. This job, this place, it breaks people eventually, and the ones who survive intact are the ones who find a purpose beyond just getting paid. Your purpose is bearing witness, is being the institutional memory, is making sure that when bad things happen, the truth doesn't get buried with the victims. Can you promise me that? Marcus had promised, had meant it with everything in him, had understood that he was accepting not just a professional obligation, but a moral one, that Jim was passing him something precious and heavy, the responsibility of carrying forward a tradition of resistance that predated both of them, that would hopefully survive long after they were gone. They'd shaken hands on it, that simple gesture carrying the weight of covenant, and then they'd return to their duties, to the endless tasks of keeping an industrial facility operating in one of the harshest environments on Earth, to the routine that would hold for exactly 11 more days before everything shattered into chaos and blood and loss that couldn't be undone. Because on October 14th, in the late afternoon, when the sun was nothing but a faint glow on the southern horizon and the temperature had dropped to 20 below zero, Jim Kowalski walked out to inspect the waste management area one final time, determined to document the continuing problems with photographs and measurements that would support his case for immediate action, and he didn't come back. Marcus had been in the equipment shed when the call came over the radio, Bear Blackstone's voice cracking with something that might have been fear or grief or horror. Wildlife incident at the waste facility. Need immediate medical response and armed security. Repeat, we have a wildlife incident. Someone's down. Marcus had dropped his tools and run, his breath crystallizing in the Arctic air, his heart hammering against his ribs. His mind refusing to process what those words probably meant, because processing it would make it real. Other workers were running too, drawn by the alarm in Bear's voice. Security personnel grabbing rifles from the arms locker. The facility's emergency protocols clicking into action with practiced efficiency. They'd reached the waste management area in less than 3 minutes. A cluster of buildings and dumpsters, surrounded by inadequate chain-link fencing that should have been replaced months ago. And Marcus had seen the bear immediately. A massive male grizzly, probably 9 feet tall when standing. 800 pounds of muscle and predatory power, its coat still thick with pre-winter fat, its muzzle stained red with fresh blood. And on the ground, motionless, except for one hand that still twitched with residual nerve signals, was Jim Kowalski, his body torn open in ways that Marcus's engineer mind, cataloged even as his emotional mind, screamed denial. Deep lacerations across the chest and abdomen, massive trauma to the skull, one arm bent at an angle that made Marcus's stomach heave. Bear Blackstone was standing between the grizzly and Jim's body, a 4-foot section of steel pipe held in both hands like a weapon, his face streaked with tears and rage, his voice breaking as he shouted at the bear in a mixture of English and Inupiaq, words that were curse and prayer and lament. The grizzly swayed uncertainly, massive head swinging between Bear and the dumpsters it had been feeding from, caught between aggression and flight response, clearly habituated enough to human presence that it wasn't immediately retreating, but not yet committed to further violence. Marcus heard himself screaming for someone to shoot it. heard security raising their rifles, heard the shots cracking across the frozen landscape. 1, 2, 3 reports that echoed off the facility buildings and rolled across the tundra toward the horizon. The Grizzly jerked with each impact, letting out a sound between roar and wail, and then it turned and ran, massive body moving with shocking speed despite the bullets that had struck it, disappearing into the twilight in the direction of the Brooks Range foothills. Later, they would find it dead 3 miles away, bled out from the wounds. But in that moment, everyone's attention was on Jim, on the slim hope that maybe he was still alive, that maybe their friend and colleague and mentor could be saved if they just acted fast enough. The medical team had arrived within minutes, and Marcus watched them work with clinical efficiency, checking for vital signs, attempting to stabilize injuries that were clearly unsurvivable, going through the motions because that's what training demanded, even when experience said it was futile. Marcus had pushed forward, had tried to reach Jim, had been held back by Tommy and Nguyen, who'd appeared beside him. Tommy's combat medic training, allowing him to assess the situation with harsh clarity. "He's gone, Marcus," Tommy had said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who delivered this news before, who knew the difference between salvageable and lost. "He was probably gone within the first minute. Nothing we could have done even if we'd been standing right here." But Marcus had struggled anyway, had needed to try, had needed to believe that somehow this could be undone, that Jim Kowalski, who'd survived 32 Arctic winters, who'd raised 2 daughters and buried a wife, who'd taught Marcus everything about integrity and documentation and resistance, couldn't possibly be dead because of an entirely preventable situation that they'd warned management about repeatedly. Eventually, they'd sedated Marcus, had taken him to the medical facility where he'd sat in shock, while the official machinery of death investigation ground into motion. Alaska State Troopers notified, federal wildlife authorities contacted, company management informed, and the beginning of what Marcus knew would be a massive cover-up operation to protect Apex Energy and Clayton Davenport from liability. The facility had locked down after the incident, all workers confined to buildings, while wildlife teams swept the area for other bears, while investigators from multiple agencies descended on the scene, while the company's legal and PR teams began constructing their narrative about what had happened and who was responsible. Marcus had sat in his quarters, surrounded by the others from Jim's group, Bear still shaking from the horror of what he'd witnessed, Maria crying quietly while staring at nothing, Tommy maintaining tactical focus while clearly struggling with his own trauma. They'd all understood immediately that this moment was critical, that the hours and days immediately following Jim's death would determine whether his sacrifice meant anything, whether the system that had killed him would face consequences or would succeed in transforming this tragedy into just another unfortunate accident that no one could have prevented. "We need to act now," Tommy had said, his military training asserting itself over grief. "Right now, while the incident is fresh, before the company's legal team can sanitize the record, before witnesses get pressured to change their stories, before documents start disappearing, we need to release everything we have. Jim's documentation, our own records, the whole case file, to every regulatory agency, every journalist, every watchdog organization that might care. We need to make this public before they can bury it." Maria had nodded, wiping her eyes and visibly pulling herself together. Jim kept copies of everything off-site, in a safe deposit box in Anchorage. His daughters have the key and instructions to turn everything over to attorneys if anything happened to him. We need to contact them immediately, make sure they know what happened, and that they follow through with Jim's contingency plans. Bear had been quieter, his usual warmth replaced by something cold and hard. "I want Davenport to answer for this. I want him in handcuffs. I want him in a courtroom. I want him in a cell." Jim died because that corporate piece of shit decided that saving a few $1,000s on a waste compound was more important than listening to someone with 32 years of experience warning him that this would happen. That's not an accident. That's not bad luck. That's negligent homicide, and I want him to pay for it. Marcus had found his voice then, rough from screaming and crying, but steady with purpose. We honor Jim by doing exactly what he taught us to do. We document everything. We build an unassailable case. We make the truth impossible to ignore. We make sure that his death doesn't become a footnote in some sanitized company report, that it becomes the catalyst that forces real change. We make them understand that people like Jim aren't disposable, that workers' lives matter, that there are consequences for treating safety as optional. We finish what Jim started, and we do it so well that his legacy becomes systemic reform that protects every worker who comes after us. They'd worked through that night and into the next day, coordinating their response while the official investigation proceeded in parallel. Tommy Nguyen had released the encrypted case files to a curated list of recipients, journalists at major newspapers and broadcast networks, environmental watchdog organizations, workplace safety advocates, congressional staffers on relevant oversight committees, the Alaska Federation of Natives, labor unions, and several attorneys who specialized in wrongful death and regulatory compliance litigation. The files contained everything Jim and the others had accumulated over years: safety violations with dates and witnesses, emails showing management's knowledge of problems, cost-benefit analyses that explicitly chose profit over safety, recordings of meetings where warnings were dismissed, and Marcus's own detailed reports about the waste management issues that had directly contributed to Jim's death. It was comprehensive, damning, and impossible to explain away as anything other than systemic negligence. Maria had contacted Jim's daughters, who were devastated but grimly determined to see their father's life's work brought to fruition, who released the safe deposit box contents to the attorneys Jim had designated, adding decades of additional documentation to the case. Bear had reached out to his family networks throughout Alaska's North Slope, to the indigenous communities who'd watched with anger as oil development disrupted their lands and threatened their traditional ways, asking them to make noise about this incident, to demand accountability from regulators who often ignored complaints from workers but couldn't easily dismiss organized pressure from Native organizations with political influence. Within 48 hours of Jim's death, the story had exploded into the national consciousness in ways that Apex Energy's PR team couldn't contain. Major newspapers ran features about workplace safety failures in the oil industry, about the specific sequence of events that led to Jim Kowalski's death, about the documented warnings that management had ignored. Television news featured interviews with Marcus and the others, their faces pixelated and voices disguised to protect them from retaliation, but their stories coming through clearly, descriptions of Davenport's harassment and intimidation, accounts of the hostile work environment that punished those who raised safety concerns, evidence of the systemic corruption that valued quarterly earnings over human lives. Environmental organizations seized on the case as an example of the oil industry's broader failures, linking Jim's death to larger questions about Arctic development and regulatory inadequacy. Congressional offices announced investigations, promising hearings and potential legislation. The Alaska state government, embarrassed by the national attention on what looked like regulatory failure, launched multiple parallel inquiries. And perhaps most significantly, Jim's daughters filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Apex Energy, Clayton Davenport personally, and several other executives, seeking not just monetary damages, but specific reforms to company safety policies and independent oversight of implementation. The company's initial response had been predictable. Official statements expressing condolences to Jim's family, promises of cooperation with investigations, assurances that this was an isolated incident not representative of company culture, strategic leaks suggesting that Jim had violated protocols by approaching the waste area alone, implications that his death was the tragic result of personal choices rather than systemic failures. But these narratives crumbled under the weight of evidence that Marcus and the others had released. Evidence that showed Jim had actually been following company procedures by inspecting the waste facilities, that the protocols he supposedly violated didn't actually exist, that he'd approached the area during daylight hours as required, that he'd been carrying all required safety equipment, and that his choice to be there was actually a direct order from his supervisor. The company's attempt to blame the victim backfired spectacularly, generating another wave of negative publicity and reinforcing the public perception of Apex Energy as a callous corporation willing to defame a dead worker to avoid accountability. Davenport himself had gone to ground, his social media accounts deleted, his whereabouts unknown, as calls for his prosecution intensified, and Alaska's Attorney General opened a criminal investigation into potential manslaughter charges. The facility itself became a media circus, helicopters circling overhead to capture footage of the site where Jim had died. Reporters camped outside the perimeter, demanding interviews with workers, regulatory officials arriving in teams to conduct the comprehensive inspections that should have happened years earlier. Marcus and the others found themselves suddenly visible in ways that were both empowering and terrifying. They'd succeeded in making Jim's death matter, enforcing accountability, but they'd also made themselves targets for corporate retaliation and legal action. Apex Energy's attorneys had sent cease and desist letters, had threatened lawsuits for release of proprietary information, had filed complaints with Alaska's Labor Board, alleging various violations of employment agreements. But the public momentum was with the workers now, and the legal threats seemed hollow in the face of widespread support from labor organizations, from environmental groups, from politicians sensing an opportunity to demonstrate responsiveness to constituent concerns. Protection orders were filed to prevent retaliation, whistleblower statutes were invoked, and a coalition of attorneys volunteered to provide free legal representation to Marcus and the others, understanding that this case could set precedents that would benefit workers throughout the industry. The Alaska State Troopers' investigation concluded within 3 weeks, and their report was devastating for Apex Energy. The investigators found that Jim Kowalski's death was a foreseeable consequence of documented safety violations and management's failure to implement required corrective actions despite repeated warnings from experienced personnel. The report detailed the specific failures: inadequate waste management systems, insufficient wildlife deterrence, lack of proper safety protocols, and a pattern of management dismissing concerns from workers with relevant expertise. The report specifically named Clayton Davenport as having primary responsibility for creating and maintaining conditions that directly contributed to the fatal incident through deliberate decisions to defer necessary safety improvements and retaliate against workers who raised concerns. The Alaska Attorney General announced criminal charges: 1 count of criminally negligent homicide, multiple counts of reckless endangerment for other workers put at risk, and several regulatory violations that carried both fines and potential jail time. Davenport was arrested at his family's estate in Texas, extradited back to Alaska, and denied bail after prosecutors argued he was a flight risk with resources to leave the country. His perp walk became national news, the image of the once arrogant supervisor in handcuffs and prison orange becoming a symbol of accountability in an age when corporate executives rarely faced personal consequences for their decisions. The federal investigations took longer, but were equally damning. OSHA concluded that Apex Energy had committed willful violations of workplace safety regulations, imposing the maximum possible fines and requiring comprehensive reforms under direct federal oversight. The EPA found multiple violations of environmental regulations, adding additional penalties and mandating third-party monitoring of the facility's waste management for the next 5 years. The Department of the Interior, which regulated oil operations on federal lands in Alaska, placed Apex Energy on probation and threatened revocation of operating permits if additional violations occurred. The cumulative financial penalties exceeded $30 million, a sum that was actually material to Apex's bottom line and sent their stock price tumbling. But more significant than the monetary penalties were the structural reforms that regulators demanded: independent safety oversight committees with worker representation, mandatory implementation of all worker-submitted safety recommendations, unless company could demonstrate they were technically infeasible, third-party auditing of compliance with environmental regulations, and personal liability clauses in executive contracts linking compensation to safety performance. These reforms, born from Jim Kowalski's death and the case that Marcus and the others had built, became models that other agencies and states began adopting, gradually transforming industry practices across the entire oil sector. Clayton Davenport's trial became a focal point for broader conversations about corporate accountability and workplace safety. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: Jim's documentation spanning 32 years, Marcus's reports detailing specific problems, recordings of safety meetings where warnings were dismissed, emails showing Davenport's explicit decisions to defer safety improvements for budget reasons, and testimony from dozens of workers describing the culture of intimidation and retaliation he'd cultivated. The defense attempted to argue that Davenport was following company policies set by his superiors, that he was a mid-level manager without ultimate authority, that the real responsibility lay with corporate executives in Houston who'd created the cost-cutting imperatives he was trying to meet. But the prosecution demolished this narrative by showing that Davenport had discretionary authority over safety decisions, that he'd gone beyond company directives in his harassment of workers who raised concerns, and that his family connections to Apex Energy's board had actually given him more protection and autonomy than typical supervisors. Marcus testified for 3 days, walking the jury through his experiences from arrival at the facility through Jim's death, his engineer's precision, and immigrants' determined English, making him a compelling witness who couldn't be dismissed as emotional or unreliable. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The sentencing hearing was where justice truly manifested, where the abstract concepts of accountability and consequence became concrete reality. Jim Kowalski's daughters gave victim impact statements that left the courtroom in tears, describing their father's dedication to his work and his family, his pride in knowing he'd spent his career trying to protect others, his excitement about finally retiring and spending time with grandchildren he'd never get to meet. Maria Gonzalez testified about what Jim had meant to the workers, about how his death had devastated a community and left a hole that couldn't be filled. Bear Blackstone spoke about witnessing the attack, about the nightmares that haunted him, about his fury that it had been preventable. Tommy Nguyen read from Jim's personal journal, passages where Jim had written about his concerns for safety, his frustration with management, his hope that documenting everything might someday make a difference. And Marcus delivered the final statement, looking directly at Davenport as he spoke, his voice clear and unwavering as he said, "Jim Kowalski taught me that integrity means doing the right thing, even when it costs you something, that true strength is protecting others rather than dominating them, that justice requires speaking truth even when powerful people want you silent. You killed him because he embodied everything you're not: courage, competence, compassion, but you failed to kill what he built, the network of workers who learned from him, the documentation that proved your guilt, the legacy that will protect people you'll never meet. Your power was always an illusion, and now everyone knows it." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, who'd spent years on Alaska's bench and seen countless cases of corporate malfeasance, sentenced Davenport to 12 years in prison, the maximum allowed under Alaska law for criminally negligent homicide, and the various other charges. She delivered a statement explaining her reasoning. The defendant's actions represent not just individual failings, but systemic corruption of safety culture in pursuit of profit. His harassment of workers who raised legitimate concerns, his deliberate deferral of necessary safety improvements, and his abuse of institutional authority to protect himself from accountability, all contributed to creating conditions that cost Jim Kowalski his life. This sentence reflects both punishment for specific crimes and deterrence to others who might believe their wealth and connections place them above the law. Let this case stand as notice that killing workers through negligence will be prosecuted as seriously as any other homicide, that corporate position provides no immunity from personal responsibility, and that workers' lives have value that exceeds any budget calculation. Davenport was led away in shackles, his face pale and shocked, clearly never having believed this outcome was possible for someone of his background and connections. His family's subsequent attempts to have the sentence reduced or gain early parole were all rejected, each denial reaffirming that the justice system, when properly pressured and documented, could actually work. But Davenport's conviction was only part of the broader reckoning that Jim's death had triggered. Apex Energy's CEO and 3 other executives were forced to resign under pressure from shareholders who faced massive liability from the wrongful death lawsuit and the various regulatory penalties. The company settled Jim Kowalski's daughter's lawsuit for an undisclosed sum reported to be in excess of $50 million, along with mandatory reforms that went beyond what regulators had required. Establishment of the Jim Kowalski Memorial Safety Foundation, funded by the company to provide safety training and support whistleblowers in the oil industry. Creation of worker councils with real authority to halt operations they deemed unsafe, and implementation of a zero-tolerance policy for retaliation against workers who raised safety concerns. with violations resulting in immediate termination of managers, regardless of their position or family connections. These reforms, born from tragedy, gradually spread throughout the industry as other companies recognized that the cost of preventing incidents was far lower than the cost of defending negligence in the court of public opinion and law. Marcus Chen emerged from this experience transformed, no longer the uncertain young engineer who'd arrived in Prudhoe Bay, but someone who'd been tested and proven, who'd helped bring down a system of corruption and established himself as a voice for workplace safety and dignity. He'd been offered numerous positions, consulting work with regulatory agencies, speaking engagements at engineering schools, even a job with a congressional committee investigating oil industry safety, but he chose to stay at the facility, to accept the promotion to senior engineer that came with better pay and more authority, because Jim Kowalski had asked him to carry forward the work, to be the institutional memory, to remain as living proof that resisting corruption was possible and necessary. He continued documenting, continued building relationships with workers, continued pushing for improvements, but now he did so with the credibility that came from having proven his commitment, from having stood against institutional power and prevailed. The younger engineers who rotated through the facility sought him out, listened to his stories about Jim Kowalski, learned from him the same lessons Jim had taught, that integrity mattered, that documentation was power, that justice required patience and preparation, and refusing to be moved from principle. The facility itself was transformed in the aftermath of Jim's death, not just physically, but culturally. The new waste management compound was state-of-the-art, designed with input from wildlife biologists, and constructed at a cost that would have seemed extravagant in the old regime, but was now understood as necessary investment in human and environmental safety. The protocols for wildlife encounters were completely overhauled, with trained specialists on staff and equipment positioned throughout the facility to enable rapid response. But more significantly, the culture shifted from top-down authoritarianism to something more collaborative, where workers felt empowered to speak up about concerns, where safety was genuinely prioritized over production schedules, where the kind of harassment and retaliation that Davenport had embodied became not just forbidden, but culturally unacceptable. Marcus had been instrumental in this transformation, serving on the facility's safety committee, helping to interview and vet new managers, sharing Jim's documentation techniques with other workers, so that the tradition of bearing witness would continue regardless of any individual's presence. In December, as the Arctic winter locked the facility in darkness for months, Marcus stood at the small memorial that had been erected where Jim Kowalski died. A simple stone marker with Jim's name and dates, with the inscription, "He stood for safety when safety required courage." The waste area behind the memorial was now unrecognizable, transformed from the dangerous, attractive nuisance it had been into a properly engineered system that posed no threat to workers or wildlife. The bears that had been attracted to easy food sources had returned to their natural patterns, denning for the winter, no longer seeing the facility as anything but a place to avoid. Marcus thought about Jim often, about the walks they'd taken across the tundra, about the lessons he'd taught, about the sacrifice he'd made, not through choice, but through the consequences of others' greed and negligence. He thought about his own father, whose back remained bent from years of hard labor, who'd called Marcus after the trial to say simply, "You honored your family, you honored yourself, that is enough." And he thought about the broader meaning of what had happened, about whether one man's death and the justice that followed could actually change systems that seemed designed to resist change, whether their victory was real or merely temporary, whether the next generation of workers would remember, or whether the lessons would need to be learned again through new tragedies. Bear Blackstone had eventually left the facility, unable to remain in the place where he'd watched his friend die. But he'd stayed in Alaska, working now as a safety consultant for native corporations, developing their own resources, bringing his experience and Jim's lessons to communities trying to balance economic development with protecting their people and lands. Maria Gonzalez had been promoted to supervisor, becoming the kind of manager who treated workers as colleagues rather than subordinates, who listened to concerns and addressed them rather than dismissing and punishing, who embodied the reformed culture that emerged from tragedy. Tommy Nguyen had taken a position with OSHA, using his military organizational skills and technical knowledge to improve workplace safety inspections across Alaska, becoming notorious among companies for his thoroughness and his refusal to accept paperwork compliance when actual practices told a different story. They'd remained in touch, the four of them, bound by shared experience and grief, and the understanding that they'd been part of something significant, that they'd helped transform personal tragedy into systemic change, that Jim Kowalski's death had not been meaningless because they'd refused to let it be buried and forgotten. The story of what happened at Prudhoe Bay in October 2016 spread beyond Alaska, beyond the oil industry, becoming a case study taught in engineering schools and business programs and safety courses as an example of what happens when corporate culture prioritizes profit over people, when workers who raise concerns are punished rather than heard, when incremental negligence accumulates into catastrophic failure. Marcus had been invited to speak at universities and conferences to share not just the facts of the case, but the lessons it taught about courage and integrity and the true meaning of professionalism. He'd tell audiences about Jim Kowalski, about a man who'd spent 32 years doing difficult work in a harsh environment, who'd raised daughters and buried a wife, who dreamed of retirement and tropical vacations he'd never get to experience, who died because someone with power and privilege decided that convenience and cost savings mattered more than heeding expert warnings. And he'd ask them, these students and engineers and managers, to consider what they would do when faced with similar choices, when pressure mounted to compromise principles, when speaking truth threatened their careers, when the easy path was silence and complicity, while the hard path was documentation and resistance. Would you have done what Jim did? Marcus would ask. Would you have kept documenting violations year after year, knowing it made you a target? Would you have mentored younger workers, teaching them to stand up for safety, even when it cost them something? Would you have walked out to that waste facility to document problems one more time, doing your job with integrity, even when you knew management resented you for it? Or would you have kept your head down, collected your paycheck, told yourself that it wasn't your responsibility to fix a broken system? And when Jim died, when his daughters were grieving, and his legacy was at risk of being buried, would you have fought to expose the truth, knowing you'd be targeted for retaliation, knowing you might lose everything you'd worked for? These aren't hypothetical questions. Every day, in workplaces across every industry, people face smaller versions of these choices, whether to report a safety violation, whether to speak up when they see something wrong, whether to support a colleague who's being harassed, whether to prioritize short-term comfort over long-term integrity. Jim Kowalski taught me that these small choices accumulate into who we are, that there's no such thing as compromise that doesn't cost us something of ourselves, that the only way to live with yourself is to be the person who stands up even when standing up is hard. The final act of justice came almost 2 years after Jim's death, when Alaska's legislature passed comprehensive workplace safety reform that became known informally as Jim's Law, new protections for whistleblowers who reported safety violations, mandatory criminal penalties for executives whose negligence led to worker deaths, requirements for worker representation on corporate safety committees, and enhanced funding for state inspections and enforcement. The bill's sponsors invited Jim's daughters to the signing ceremony, along with Marcus and the others who'd fought to turn their friend's death into meaningful change. As Alaska's governor signed the legislation, cameras capturing the moment for news broadcasts that would carry the story nationwide, Marcus had felt something release in his chest, some tension he'd been carrying for 2 years, finally easing. This was what Jim had wanted, not just individual accountability for Davenport, but systemic reform that would protect workers he'd never meet, whose names he'd never know, who'd benefit from lessons bought with his life. This was the real victory, not just punishing the guilty, but preventing future tragedies, not just seeking revenge, but creating change, not just making noise, but making difference. The moral of this story, if stories about senseless death and hard-won justice can have morals, is that power doesn't respect anything except consequences, that systems change only when maintaining the status quo becomes more expensive than reform, that individual courage matters precisely because it can spark collective action that no corporation or institution can ultimately resist. Jim Kowalski died doing his job, trying to protect his colleagues, warning about dangers that his supervisors dismissed, because acknowledging those dangers required spending money and admitting fault. His death was a tragedy that should have been prevented, that would have been prevented if even a fraction of the reforms that followed had been implemented beforehand. That represents the cost of corporate cultures that treat workers as expenses rather than humans. But his death wasn't meaningless, because Marcus Chen and Bear Blackstone and Maria Gonzalez and Tommy Nguyen refused to let it be, because they honored their friend by finishing what he started, because they understood that the best memorial to someone who died fighting for safety was ensuring others wouldn't have to make the same sacrifice. They proved that even against powerful corporations with expensive lawyers and political connections, truth eventually prevails if enough people commit to documenting and sharing it. That justice delayed isn't justice denied if you're persistent enough. That workers standing together with integrity and evidence can defeat systems designed to exploit and silence them. Share this story with anyone who works in industries where safety is supposed to be paramount, but often becomes secondary to profit. Share it with managers who need to understand that their decisions have real consequences for real people. Share it with young people entering careers, so they know that integrity isn't just an abstract virtue, but a practical necessity, that the cost of compromise accumulates until one day you're complicit in something you can't justify. And share it with yourself, as a reminder that we all face moments when we have to choose between convenience and conscience, between staying silent to protect ourselves or speaking truth to protect others, between being the person who documents violations or the person who enables them through indifference. Jim Kowalski chose courage over comfort for 32 years, and when it cost him his life, the people he'd mentored chose to honor that courage by ensuring his death meant something, that it changed systems, that it protected the future, even as it couldn't change the past. That's the power we all have. Not to prevent every tragedy, but to decide what tragedies mean, whether they become forgotten statistics or catalysts for transformation. The question isn't whether you'll face these choices, because you will, in your workplace or your community or your family. The question is what you'll do when that moment comes, whether you'll be the person who looks away or the person who bears witness, whether you'll prioritize your comfort or your conscience, whether you'll be remembered as someone who stood for something, or someone who stood aside while others suffered. That's the legacy Jim Kowalski left, and that's the challenge Marcus Chen carries forward, to be the person who refuses to look away, who documents the truth even when it's inconvenient, who stands up for others even when it costs something, who believes that justice is possible if you're willing to fight for it with patience and evidence and unwavering commitment to principle over expedience. The window exploded inward with a sound like thunder, glass shards catching the firelight as they scattered across the tatami mats. And in the same breath, a massive black shape filled the opening, its fur silver-tipped in the moonlight, eyes reflecting gold and wild with hunger. Takeshi Yamamoto, 72 years old, veteran of 2 wars and survivor of countless Hokkaido winters, barely had time to rise from his evening tea before the Asiatic black bear was upon him. 400 pounds of desperate predator driven mad by starvation. The old man's calloused hands, which had worked this land for 5 decades, came up instinctively in the fighting stance he'd learned in Manchuria. But what use were human hands against claws designed by millennia of evolution? The bear's roar filled the small farmhouse like the voice of the mountain itself, a sound of rage and sorrow mixed together, and as those terrible jaws closed around Takeshi's shoulder, as his blood began to pool on the floor his grandfather had laid stone by stone, one thought cut through the pain with crystal clarity. This was not the bear's fault. But what the arrogant men in their Sapporo offices didn't know, what the wealthy developers who had stripped these mountains bare couldn't comprehend, was that Takeshi Yamamoto had a grandson who had learned everything the old man knew about justice, about the land, about the ancient contract between humans and the wild. Subscribe now to witness how one family's tragedy became a reckoning that shook the foundations of power in Hokkaido, how the death of one man sparked a movement that would restore balance to these suffering mountains. But let's rewind to where it all began, 6 months before that terrible November night, to the spring of 1961, when the cherry blossoms still fell like snow on a village that didn't yet know its world was ending. The village of Shirakawa sat in a valley between 2 mountains, like a secret kept by the earth itself, 43 houses clustered around a shrine that had stood for 300 years, their thatched roofs dark with age and care. Takeshi Yamamoto rose each morning at 4:30, his body moving through the rituals of 72 years with the precision of ceremony, lighting the brazier, boiling water for tea, offering rice to the small shrine in his home, where his wife's photograph smiled eternally from her perch among the ancestors. His hands were oak bark, gnarled and spotted with age, but they could still coax life from reluctant soil, still tie the knots that his father had taught him, still remember the weight of a rifle from the war, though he'd sworn never to hold one again. The farmhouse where he lived alone had been in his family for 6 generations, its beams cut from trees his great-great-grandfather had selected, its foundation stones placed according to geomantic principles that modern people laughed at, but which had kept the house standing through earthquakes that had leveled everything around it. He was a small man, as most men of his generation were, barely 5 feet 4 inches, but he moved with the economy of someone who had never wasted a motion in his life, every gesture precise and purposeful. His face was a relief map of suffering and perseverance, deep lines carved by sun and loss. But his eyes remained sharp as flint, missing nothing, and when he smiled at the children who came to help him in the fields, that smile transformed him into something ageless and kind. Each morning after his tea, Takeshi would walk the boundaries of his land, 3 acres of terraced rice paddies that climbed the hillside like steps cut for giants, checking the irrigation channels his grandfather had dug, pulling weeds with his bare hands because herbicides offended his sense of what farming should be. He would pause at certain spots where the land spoke to him, where a badger had dug a den, or where wild mushrooms pushed through the leaf litter, and he would nod as if confirming something with an old friend. The other villagers said Takeshi understood the mountain's moods better than any man alive, that he could smell snow 3 days before it fell, that he knew when the bears were moving to their winter dens by the way the crows called in the morning. He had lived through the American bombs, through the starvation of the war's end, when people had eaten bark and grass to survive, through the loss of his only son to tuberculosis and his wife to heartbreak 2 years after, and he had emerged from each disaster with his kindness intact, which the other elders said was either the mark of a fool or a saint. Every Tuesday, he would carry a basket of vegetables down to the widow Tanaka, who lived on the edge of the village with her 3 children, leaving it on her doorstep before dawn, so she wouldn't feel shame at accepting charity. Every Saturday, he would tend the small cemetery behind the shrine, pulling weeds from graves of people he'd never known, because someone should remember, because respect for the dead was respect for life itself. The village children adored him, because he never scolded, only suggested, and because he told stories about the old days when bears and humans had an understanding, when offerings were left at the forest edge, and the bears stayed in their territory, and humans stayed in theirs. Takeshi's grandson, Kenji Yamamoto, was 19 years old that spring, home on break from Hokkaido University in Sapporo, where he studied forestry on a scholarship that barely covered his books. Kenji was everything the new Japan wanted its young people to be, tall for his generation at 5 feet 9, educated, ambitious, ready to leave the old ways behind for the gleaming promise of modernization. But something in him still responded to his grandfather's teachings, still felt the pull of the land that had sustained his family for so long. He would watch the old man work the fields with a mixture of admiration and impatience, wanting to tell him about tractors and modern irrigation, but holding his tongue out of respect. Kenji had his grandfather's sharp eyes, but his father's height, his mother's quick mind, but his grandfather's stubborn streak, and he carried in his heart the burden of being the last of his line, the only one left to remember all the stories, all the lessons, all the names of the ancestors who had worked this same soil. He had promised his grandfather he would return to Shirakawa after graduation, though his classmates in Sapporo laughed at the idea of going back to a dying village when the cities offered everything. Some nights, when he couldn't sleep in his tiny room in Sapporo, Kenji would remember the smell of his grandfather's farmhouse, the clean scent of tatami and hinoki wood, the sound of the old man moving through his morning routines like a priest performing mass, and he would feel something in his chest tighten with a longing he couldn't name. He wrote his grandfather letters every week, filling them with observations about his classes, questions about the planting season, careful omissions of how hard the city was, how lonely, how the other students with their wealthy parents and city Polish made him feel like a country mouse playing at being educated. The mountain that rose behind Shirakawa had no official name on maps, but the villagers called it Kumayama, Bear Mountain, because for as long as anyone remembered, it had been home to Asiatic black bears, the magnificent moon bears with the white crescents on their chests like celestial markings. These bears were not the massive brown bears of Europe or North America, but they were formidable enough, weighing up to 400 pounds, equipped with claws that could tear through tree bark like paper, and jaws that could crack deer bones for the marrow. But they were also shy, almost comically cautious, more likely to run from humans than confront them. The old people of Shirakawa told stories about the understanding, about how their ancestors had set boundaries, had left offerings of persimmons and chestnuts at certain stones in the forest, had built small shrines that marked the territory where bears ruled and humans did not go. In return, the bears stayed high on the mountain, emerging only in autumn to feed on the acorns and beech nuts that fell in abundance, occasionally raiding a field at the forest edge, but never coming down into the village proper. Takeshi could remember seeing bears dozens of times in his life, always at a distance, always in the half-light of dawn or dusk, their black forms moving through the forest like shadows with substance. He taught Kenji to read their signs, the distinctive claw marks on trees where they stretched and marked their territory, the excavated stumps where they had torn apart rotting wood, searching for insects, the well-worn trails they used to move between feeding areas. There was a protocol to follow if you encountered a bear. Make yourself large, speak firmly, but don't shout, back away slowly while facing them, never run, because that triggered their chase instinct. In his 72 years, Takeshi had never heard of a bear attacking a human in Shirakawa, not once, and that peace was something he considered sacred. Proof that the old ways worked, that respect and boundaries could create harmony even between such different kinds of creatures. But that spring, something new came to the mountain, something that didn't respect boundaries or understand the ancient contracts. Hokkaido Development Corporation was its name, a company formed by the merger of 3 smaller firms, backed by money from Tokyo and Osaka, led by men who had never seen a forest except from the window of a train. They arrived in their dark suits and polished shoes, carrying maps and surveys, speaking of progress and economic development, of Japan's need for lumber to rebuild itself into a modern nation. Their leader was a man named Takeshi Sato, though he insisted everyone call him Sato-san, even though the honorific should have been earned, not demanded. A man of 45 who wore his wealth like armor, Swiss watch flashing on his wrist, silk tie perfectly knotted even in the mountain heat. He had the soft hands of someone who had never worked with tools, the quick, aggressive speech of someone used to being obeyed, and the absolute certainty of someone who believed that whatever he wanted must be correct, because he was the one wanting it. Sato-san had 3 men with him that first day they came to Shirakawa. Tanaka, his assistant, who carried a leather briefcase and wrote everything down in a leather notebook. Kobayashi, the surveyor, who looked at the mountains with a calculator's eye and saw only board feet of lumber. And Watanabe, the lawyer, who had a gift for making exploitation sound like philanthropy. They held a meeting in the village hall, a drafty building with warped floorboards and walls covered in fading notices about festivals and lost cats. And Sato-san stood at the front like a teacher addressing students, his smile bright and meaningless as chrome. "Gentlemen," Sato-san began, though there were women present, old Mrs. Kimura and young widow Tanaka, and a dozen others who had every right to be there. "Hokkaido Development Corporation brings opportunity to Shirakawa. Your mountain," he gestured vaguely toward the window, as if the mountain were a piece of furniture they happened to possess, "contains timber worth millions of yen. We are prepared to offer fair compensation for logging rights, jobs for your young men, a road that will connect you to the highway, electricity poles, telephone lines, everything the modern world can provide." His presentation included glossy photographs of other villages they had developed, showing new buildings and paved roads, though the photographs were carefully cropped to avoid showing the mudslides and eroded hillsides, the streams choked with silt, the silence where birdsong used to be. Sato-san's assistant passed out contracts, thick documents full of legal language that might as well have been Chinese for most of the villagers, all of whom had maybe 6 years of formal education. The contracts gave Hokkaido Development Corporation the right to log any tree over 50 years old. which meant essentially every tree worth cutting for a period of 5 years in exchange for a one-time payment of 30,000 yen per household and a promise of employment. 30,000 yen sounded like wealth to farmers who measured their annual income in hundreds, but it was less than what Sato-san spent on his suits, less than the depreciation on his company car, a fraction of what the timber would fetch on the market. Some of the younger men were excited, talking about the jobs, the money, the road that would let them drive to Sapporo in under an hour instead of taking the bus that came twice a week. But the older villagers sat silent, their weathered faces unreadable, and Takeshi Yamamoto sat in the back row with his arms crossed over his chest, listening to every word with the intensity of someone who recognized a threat. When Sato-san asked if there were any questions, Takeshi raised his hand slowly, and something about the gesture, the quiet dignity of it, made the room go silent. "Sato-san," Takeshi said, his voice soft but carrying. "Has your company studied what happens to the bears when you remove the forest? Have you calculated the cost of mudslides and flooding? Have you considered that this mountain has provided for this village for 300 years and might provide for 300 more if we don't destroy it for a single season's profit?" His questions were simple but devastating, cutting through the glossy presentation to the essential truth. And Sato-san's smile thinned to something sharp and cold. "Old man," Sato-san said, and the dismissal in those 2 words was like a slap. "Japan cannot build its future by clinging to the past. Your way of thinking, this superstitious attachment to trees and animals, is exactly what kept this country poor and weak. We must embrace progress. We must sacrifice the old to create the new. We must be willing to transform ourselves." He said it with the fervor of a convert, a man who had himself come from poverty, and now despised any reminder of that past, who saw in tradition only chains, and in change, only liberation. Takeshi sat down without responding, but his face had set in the expression that his grandson knew meant the old man had made a decision and would not be moved from it. After the meeting, when the other villagers milled around, looking at the contracts, half ready to sign, if only to get the money that seemed so impossibly large, Takeshi walked out into the spring evening and stood looking up at the mountain, its flanks dark with the ancient forest, its peak still topped with the season's last snow. "They don't understand," he said quietly to himself, though Kenji, who had followed him out, heard every word. "They think the mountain is a warehouse full of products. They don't know it's alive, that everything is connected, that when you cut the trees, you don't just remove wood, you remove the future." Over the following weeks, Sato-san and his men worked their way through the village, like salesmen selling salvation, targeting the families who were struggling, the ones with sick parents or children who needed medicine or houses that needed repair. The 30,000 yen was real money, enough to matter, and one by one, families signed the contracts, some with enthusiasm, some with resignation, all of them swayed by the argument that progress was inevitable, that they could either participate and profit or be left behind. Hokkaido Development Corporation was careful to emphasize that the logging would be selective, that they would leave enough trees to prevent erosion, that modern forestry techniques meant there would be no damage to the environment. They brought in a scientist from Sapporo, a thin man with glasses who talked about sustainable harvest rates and regeneration cycles in words designed to confuse and reassure simultaneously. But when Takeshi asked this scientist direct questions, what would happen to the spring melt if the tree cover was reduced by 60%? Where would the bears den in winter without the old-growth hollows? How would they prevent siltation of the streams that fed the village's rice paddies? The man had only vague assurances and no actual answers. By May, 40 of the 43 families had signed contracts, seduced by money and the promise of jobs and the sheer momentum of the thing. Only 3 households held out: Takeshi Yamamoto, old Mr. Fujimoto who lived in a cabin so far up the mountain trail that finding him to get a signature was more trouble than it was worth, and young widow Tanaka, who couldn't read the contract and didn't trust what she couldn't understand. Sato-san tried charm with Takeshi, offering him double the payment, then triple, but the old man refused without explanation. Sato-san tried intimidation, suggesting that a man who stood against progress might find himself isolated, might discover that the new road somehow failed to reach his property, might learn that standing in the way of development had consequences. But Takeshi had survived things that made Sato-san's threats sound like children playing tough, and he simply smiled his gentle smile and said he was content with his decision. The logging began in June, and with it came a transformation of the mountain that happened with shocking speed. The company brought in trucks that groaned up the new road they'd bulldozed in a matter of weeks, brought in chainsaws that screamed through wood that had stood for centuries, brought in workers from Sapporo and even farther south, men who needed the wages and didn't care what they were cutting as long as the paychecks came. The village men who'd been hired as guides and laborers found themselves doing grunt work, hauling chain, clearing brush, watching as men with no connection to this place treated the ancient forest like an inconvenience to be removed as efficiently as possible. The sound of chainsaws became a constant backdrop to village life, a grinding roar that started at dawn and continued until dusk, punctuated by the crash of falling giants and the growl of truck engines. Takeshi would stand at the edge of his property and watch the transformation, his face a mask of sorrow that he tried to hide from his grandson. Whole sections of the mountainside were cleared in days, leaving behind a landscape of stumps and slash piles, the earth raw and exposed like a wound. The company was supposed to be selective, taking only certain trees, but in practice they took anything worth money, anything that would fill a truck, anything that met the calculator's definition of profit. The slash piles, mountains of branches and bark and wood, too small or twisted to sell, sat like pyres waiting for someone to light them. And when it rained, which it did often that June, the exposed soil turned to mud that ran down the mountain in rusty streams, clouding the water in the irrigation channels and filling the rice paddies with silt that would take years to wash away. But the economic effect on the village was undeniable. Money flowed in, and with it came changes that seemed like progress. The widow Tanaka bought medicine for her youngest child, who had been sick all winter. Old Mr. Saito repaired his roof. Young couples talked about buying motorcycles and television sets. The village men, who worked for the logging company, came home each evening with stories about the money they were making, more in a month than they'd make in a year of farming. And they talked about moving to cities, buying businesses, escaping the grinding poverty that had defined rural Hokkaido for generations. Sato-san established himself in the village like a feudal lord, renting the largest house, treating everyone to drinks at the small restaurant, handing out small gifts and large promises. He held court in the evenings, sitting at the best table, surrounded by the men he'd hired, talking about the future he was building, the prosperity he was bringing, the gratitude they all should feel for his vision and generosity. He made a particular show of ignoring Takeshi Yamamoto whenever their paths crossed, turning away in mid-conversation if the old man approached, laughing with his associates about the stubborn farmer who didn't understand the modern world. It was a calculated cruelty designed to isolate Takeshi, to make him feel the cost of his resistance, to demonstrate that standing against Sato-san meant being cut off from the community's newfound prosperity. Some of the younger villagers, drunk on money and possibility, began to see Takeshi as an obstacle, a relic, whose superstitious attachment to old ways was holding everyone back. They stopped visiting him, stopped helping with his planting, stopped seeking his advice, and the old man felt the isolation like a physical weight. Kenji watched all this from Sapporo with growing alarm, reading his grandfather's letters, where the old man tried to minimize the damage, but couldn't hide the distress in his careful handwriting. The letters became shorter, less frequent, as if Takeshi was withdrawing into himself, unable to bear witness to what was happening and unable to stop it. Kenji came home in July for the Yobon Festival, the time when ancestors returned to visit the living, and what he saw shocked him. The mountain he had grown up with, the green wall that had been the backdrop to his entire life, was scarred with clear cuts visible even from the village, brown wounds in the forest's face. The streams ran muddy even days after rain, and the sound of chainsaws was inescapable, a violent intrusion into what had been a place of natural quiet. His grandfather seemed smaller somehow, older, the weight of watching helplessly as his world was dismantled, showing in the stoop of his shoulders and the new lines around his eyes. They walked the mountain trail together, something they'd done countless times, but now it was like walking through a battlefield, stumps everywhere, slash piles smoldering, the forest floor torn up by machinery. The undergrowth that had been thick with ferns and wild azaleas was gone, crushed under the weight of progress, and the birdsong that had been a constant presence was reduced to a few sparse calls from birds that hadn't yet learned to flee. They found a huge, old beech tree, one that Kenji remembered climbing as a child, marked with orange spray paint, tagged for cutting. "This tree is 300 years old," Takeshi said quietly, running his gnarled hand over the bark with something like tenderness. "It was here before the village, before any human touched this land, and they'll cut it down tomorrow to make plywood, to build cheap apartments in Osaka that will last maybe 30 years. Tell me, grandson, is this what they teach you in university? That such exchanges are progress?" Kenji spent that summer investigating, using his university connections to research Hokkaido Development Corporation, and what he found made his blood run cold. The company was notorious, leaving a trail of environmental disasters across Hokkaido. Mountains logged to bare earth that now suffered annual mudslides, streams destroyed by siltation, villages that had taken the money and found themselves worse off 5 years later, when the logging was done and the jobs were gone and the land was too damaged to farm or support game. There were rumors of bribed officials, of environmental assessments falsified, of contracts that seemed fair on the surface but contained clauses that let the company avoid any responsibility for the damage they caused. Sato-san himself had a history, a poor kid from rural Aomori who had clawed his way to wealth through a combination of ruthless business practices and strategic friendships with politicians and bureaucrats. He saw himself as a self-made man, a warrior against the old Japan that had kept people like him poor, and he approached every project with the fervor of someone settling scores. Kenji wrote to his professors, to environmental groups in Sapporo, to newspapers, but found little interest. Environmental protection wasn't yet the cause it would become, and rural Hokkaido seemed impossibly far from the concerns of city-dwelling intellectuals. One professor told him frankly that economic development was the priority for Japan, that a few damaged mountains were an acceptable price for lifting the nation out of poverty, that Kenji should focus on his studies rather than playing activist. But Kenji couldn't let it go, couldn't unsee what he'd seen, couldn't abandon his grandfather to face this alone. He began documenting everything with his camera, taking photographs of the clear cuts, the muddy streams, the slash piles, building a case without quite knowing what he would do with it. By August, the bear sightings began. The villagers had lived alongside bears for generations without incident, but now bears were appearing where they'd never been seen before, wandering down into the cultivated valleys, raiding gardens, breaking into sheds. A mother bear with 2 cubs was spotted near the village shrine at midday, something unheard of. Bears were seen swimming across the river, crossing the road, moving through spaces that had always been human territory. The changes were subtle at first, easy to dismiss as unusual but not alarming. But Takeshi recognized them immediately for what they were. The bears were being displaced, driven from their traditional territory by the destruction of their food sources, forced into conflict with humans, not out of aggression, but out of desperation. He tried to warn people, explaining that the bears' behavior indicated severe stress, that without the forest canopy, the acorn-bearing oaks weren't producing nuts, that the destruction of the berry bushes and the excavation of the forest floor meant the bears were facing starvation, but his warnings were dismissed as more superstitious nonsense from an old man who couldn't accept change. Sato-san, when informed of the bear sightings, laughed and said it was good news because it meant there would be hunting opportunities, that rich tourists from Tokyo would pay money to hunt bears, that they could turn the problem into profit. He proposed organizing hunting parties, selling licenses, building a lodge for wealthy sportsmen. The fact that the Asiatic black bear was already declining in numbers, that it might need protection rather than exploitation, didn't enter his calculations because the bear had no value to him, beyond what it might fetch as a trophy or a nuisance to be eliminated. In September, as autumn approached, and the bears should have been entering hyperphagia, the frantic feeding period before winter denning, the situation worsened. The logging had removed most of the mass-producing trees, the oaks and beeches, whose nuts sustained the bears through fall fattening. What trees remained were isolated, their nuts often unripe because the forest microclimate had been disrupted. The bears were desperate, losing weight when they should have been gaining it, facing the prospect of entering winter dens without sufficient fat reserves to survive hibernation. A male bear broke into a storehouse and ate 50 pounds of rice, so gorged it could barely move when the villagers discovered it. Another bear was found dead at the base of a cliff, apparently having fallen while in a weakened state. The prefectural wildlife office sent a biologist to investigate, a young woman named Yumiko Sato, no relation to the developer, who took one look at the situation and wrote a scathing report recommending immediate cessation of logging and emergency feeding stations for the bears. Her report was filed and ignored, her recommendations deemed too expensive and too disruptive to economic development. She left frustrated and angry, but not before telling Takeshi that he was right to resist, that what was happening was criminal negligence disguised as progress. Kenji met with her in Sapporo, and she gave him copies of her report, her data, her photographs of emaciated bears and destroyed habitat. "Make them hear you," she told him, "because if you don't, people are going to die. These bears are desperate enough to do things they would never do under normal circumstances, and when a starving bear encounters a human, the outcome is unpredictable." October brought the first snow to the peaks, and with it a sense of foreboding that settled over the village like a fog. The bears should have been denning, retreating to their winter sanctuaries to sleep through the harshest months. But instead, they were still active, still searching for food, their behavior growing increasingly bold and erratic. Takeshi reinforced his doors and windows, set up electric fencing around his vegetable garden, placed bells at the forest edge that would sound if something large moved through them. He was taking precautions, but he was also, in a way, preparing himself for the inevitable. He told Kenji during one of their evening phone calls that he felt the mountain's anger, that the broken contract between humans and bears was creating a debt that would come due. "We promised to leave them their space," he said, his voice tired and sad, "and we broke that promise. Now they have no choice but to come into our space, and when they do, we'll call them monsters and kill them, and we'll learn nothing from it." He spoke about the nature of hunger, how it drove even the most cautious creatures to take terrible risks, how desperation erased fear and caution and left only the drive to survive. He spoke about how the bears weren't evil or cruel, they were just hungry, and humans had created that hunger through greed and thoughtlessness. And now, both bears and humans would pay the price for that error. The logging slowed as winter approached, the company planning to resume in spring, but the damage was comprehensive. 60% of the old-growth forest was gone. The mountainside transformed from an ecosystem into a timber plantation. The rich biodiversity reduced to a few hardy species that could tolerate the disturbed conditions. The streams that had run clear for centuries were permanently damaged, their banks eroded, their beds filled with silt that would take decades to clear. The village had its money, had its new road and electricity poles, but it also had something else, a growing unease, a sense that something fundamental had shifted, that they had made a bargain whose true cost was yet to be revealed. Sato-san left for Sapporo in late October, promising to return in spring to oversee the next phase, satisfied that he'd conquered another mountain, extracted another fortune, proven once again that progress was inevitable and resistance was futile. He left behind his assistant Tanaka to manage the winter shutdown, to guard the equipment, to maintain the company's presence. Tanaka was a different man than his boss, quieter, more thoughtful, troubled by some of what he'd seen, but not quite able to articulate his concerns or act on them. He'd grown up in rural Akita, had his own memories of forests and mountains, had his own complicated feelings about development and tradition, but he'd learned to keep those feelings buried because sentiment didn't pay bills, and the job market was unforgiving. He watched Takeshi Yamamoto sometimes, the old man working his fields alone, stubbornly maintaining his routines despite the isolation, despite the scorn of neighbors who'd taken the money, and Tanaka felt something like admiration mixed with pity for someone who couldn't understand that the old world was gone and wasn't coming back. November came with unusual cold, the first heavy snows arriving weeks early, and the bears, who should have been safely denned, were still roaming, still desperately seeking food. On November 15th, a bear broke into the Suzuki's barn and killed 3 goats, eating them entirely, bones and all, in its hunger. On November 20th, a massive male bear was seen at the village edge in full daylight, standing upright, sniffing the air, its ribs visible through its fur. The village headman called a meeting to discuss what should be done, and the consensus was to hire hunters, to eliminate the bears before they eliminated someone. Takeshi attended that meeting, and spoke against the killing, arguing that the bears were victims, not villains, that humans had created this crisis and should solve it humanely, that feeding stations could be established, that they could use their new road to truck in food for the bears, that killing them would only eliminate the symptom while ignoring the disease. But he was shouted down, called naive, called a fool, who cared more about animals than people, and the vote was taken to hire professional hunters from Asahikawa, who would come with dogs and high-powered rifles to eliminate the bear problem permanently. The hunters would arrive after the holiday, after Christmas, which the village didn't celebrate, but which had become a marker in the calendar nonetheless. A few weeks away, Takeshi left that meeting knowing that he'd failed, that his voice no longer carried weight, that he'd been marginalized into irrelevance, and he walked home through snow that fell like ash from the sky. The night of November 24th was bitter cold, temperature plunging to -15 Celsius, the kind of cold that made your breath freeze in your nostrils and your fingers go numb even through gloves. Takeshi had spent the day preparing his house for winter, checking the insulation, stacking firewood, making sure his food stores were adequate. He'd made himself a simple dinner, rice and pickled vegetables and miso soup, eaten while listening to the radio news from Sapporo that talked about economic growth and political developments, and made no mention of starving bears or destroyed forests. He was settled by his brazier with his evening tea when he heard the sound outside, a heavy shuffling crunch in the snow, the sound of something large moving around his house. He set down his tea and listened, his old soldier's instincts awakening, knowing immediately that this wasn't a deer or a fox, that this was something substantial and potentially dangerous. The sound moved around the house, investigating, and Takeshi could hear breathing, heavy and labored, the sound of an animal in distress. He moved slowly to the window, peered through the gap in the shutters, and saw it in the moonlight. A massive moon bear, a male by its size, moving like something half dead, stumbling, its movements uncoordinated and desperate. The bear was enormous, easily 400 pounds even in its emaciated state, its black fur silver-tipped and beautiful, the white crescent on its chest perfect as if painted there by an artist's brush. But its ribs were visible, its eyes were dull with starvation, and it moved with the single-minded intensity of a creature that had exhausted every option and was willing to try anything, risk anything for a chance at food. Takeshi's house smelled of food, of the rice he'd cooked, of the fish he'd grilled earlier, of the stores in his cellar, and to a starving bear, it must have seemed like salvation. The bear approached the door, stood upright higher than the roof of the porch, and tested it with its paws, pushing, testing the strength. Takeshi backed away slowly, moving to where he kept his father's old hunting rifle, unloaded and unused in 30 years, a relic of a different time. He'd sworn never to kill again after the war, had vowed to live in peace with all creatures, but he was also practical enough to know that ideals sometimes met reality in sharp ways. He loaded the rifle with hands that remembered the movements even after decades, but even as he did so, he felt the weight of sorrow, the knowledge that if he killed this bear, he would be killing a victim, not a villain. The bear, finding the door secure, moved to the window that faced south and caught the morning sun, the window through which Takeshi watched the seasons change. The bear's massive head appeared in the window, blocking the moonlight, and for a moment, human and bear looked at each other across the barrier of glass and wood and wildly different natures. Takeshi saw intelligence in those eyes, saw suffering, saw desperation, and the bear saw whatever bears see in humans. Threat or opportunity, or simply an obstacle between it and survival. Then the bear raised one paw, claws extended, and struck the window with the force of hunger-driven desperation. The glass exploded inward in a shower of crystalline shards, and the bear followed, forcing its massive body through the opening with surprising agility, driven by the smell of food and the promise of warmth and the desperate hope that this violation would provide what the forest no longer could. Takeshi had perhaps 2 seconds to decide, 2 seconds in which he could have raised the rifle and fired, could have defended himself with deadly force, could have killed this magnificent creature that was breaking every natural law in its desperation to live. But in those 2 seconds, Takeshi Yamamoto made a choice that defined everything that followed. He set down the rifle, he stood up, facing the bear, and he spoke to it in the voice he'd used all his life when talking to animals, calm and firm and without fear. "You are not evil," he said in Japanese that the bear couldn't understand but whose tone was clear enough. "You are hungry, and that is our fault, and I will not add to the debt we owe you by taking your life. Whether the bear understood, or whether it was simply too desperate to care, it closed the distance between them in a single bound. Takeshi raised his hands, not in self-defense, but in a gesture that was half benediction and half acknowledgement, and the bear, 400 pounds of starving predator, did what starvation had driven it to do. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, claws tearing through his shoulder like he was made of rice paper, jaws closing on flesh and bone with the crushing power of a steel trap. Takeshi made no sound, or perhaps he couldn't, the shock robbing him of voice. And as he fell to the tatami that his grandfather had woven, as his blood pooled on the floor that had known 72 years of his footsteps, his last coherent thought was not of pain or fear, but of his grandson, and of hope that someone would understand, would use this terrible moment to wake others from their comfortable denial. The bear fed, not from cruelty, but from the simple brutal imperative of starvation, and when it left, an hour later, squeezing back through the broken window, it left behind a scene of primal tragedy. Takeshi Yamamoto died alone in his house, died from blood loss and shock and the catastrophic trauma of a bear attack, died because greed and thoughtlessness had broken a contract 300 years old, died as a witness to what happens when humans treat nature as an enemy to be conquered rather than a partner to be respected. The next morning, when he didn't appear for his usual morning walk, a neighbor came to investigate and found the broken window, the blood, the horror of violent death, and the village erupted into outrage and fear and righteous anger. They called the police, called the hunters, organized search parties to find and kill the bear that had dared to do this thing. No one, in those first hours, asked why the bear had been so desperate. No one questioned what had driven it to such an extreme violation of its nature. No one connected the clear-cut forest with the dead old man. They saw only a monster that needed to be destroyed, and they were very ready to destroy it. But Kenji Yamamoto, called home from Sapporo by a phone call that shattered his world, saw everything. He saw his grandfather's body, saw the broken window, saw the bear tracks in the snow, and understood with perfect clarity what had happened and why. His grief was a physical force that buckled his knees, made him vomit in the snow outside his grandfather's house, left him shaking and hollow. But beneath the grief was something else, something cold and focused, and absolutely implacable. Rage. Not at the bear, which had only done what desperation demanded, but at the men who had created that desperation, who had destroyed the forest and dismissed the warnings and taken their profits without caring about the cost. As he stood in his grandfather's house, as he looked at the simple life his grandfather had lived, the dignity with which he'd faced his death, something crystallized in Kenji's mind with the clarity of a vow. He would make them answer for this. He would make sure his grandfather's death meant something. He would use every tool at his disposal, every connection, every skill he'd learned to bring justice to this place. Not revenge, which was heat without purpose, but justice, which was the cold application of consequences to those who'd earned them. The funeral was held 3 days later, a Buddhist ceremony attended by the entire village. The monks chanting sutras while incense smoke rose like prayers toward a sky that held no answers. Kenji stood beside the altar, his face empty of expression, accepting condolences from neighbors who had scorned his grandfather in life, but now praised him in death. As is the way with funerals, Sato-san sent a wreath and a note expressing his condolences, a gesture so hollow it was almost insulting, but he didn't attend himself, apparently finding it beneath his dignity to mourn a man who'd opposed him. Tanaka, the assistant, did come, standing in the back, his face troubled, and after the ceremony, he approached Kenji with genuine sympathy in his eyes. "Your grandfather was right," Tanaka said quietly, his voice low enough that others wouldn't hear. "About everything, the logging, the bears, the cost. He was right, and we didn't listen, and now, this." It was the first crack in the armor of corporate certainty, the first acknowledgement that maybe, possibly, the old man's death wasn't just a random tragedy, but a consequence, a price paid for specific decisions made by specific people. Kenji filed that away, that crack in Tanaka's composure, sensing that it might be useful later. He thanked Tanaka with cold courtesy, and turned to accept more condolences, his mind already working on the problem of how to make powerful men pay for the damage they'd caused. The hunters killed the bear 2 days after the funeral, tracking it through the snow to a cave where it had finally denned, too exhausted to run anymore. They shot it with rifles, killed it efficiently and without ceremony, and brought its body down the mountain on a sled. The villagers gathered to see it, this monster that had killed one of their own, and they found not a monster, but a creature so emaciated it was almost unrecognizable, a skeleton wrapped in fur, its ribs like barrel hoops under its hide, its belly hollow, its paws worn bloody from desperate wandering. The village veterinarian performed a quick examination and found the bear's stomach contained bark, stones, and a leather glove it had swallowed whole in its desperation, nothing that could sustain life. This bear was starving to death, the vet said, her voice shaking with anger and pity. It was dying when it broke into that house. It wasn't attacking, it was begging. The words hung in the cold air, uncomfortable and damning, and people began to look at each other differently, began to question the narrative they'd accepted, began to wonder if maybe the old man had been right all along. Kenji watched this shift happen, this dawning awareness, and he knew his moment was coming. He'd spent the days since his grandfather's death gathering evidence, calling in favors, contacting the biologist Yumiko Sato, the environmental groups his professors had dismissed, the local newspaper that had ignored his earlier letters. Now, with a dead bear and a dead man, and a village starting to question what they'd done, he had an audience ready to listen. The village meeting was called for the 7th day after Takeshi's death, a traditional marker of mourning, and it was standing room only in the community hall. Kenji stood at the front, and beside him stood Yumiko Sato with her scientific reports. Stood a lawyer from Sapporo who'd agreed to take the case pro bono after reading Kenji's documentation. Stood several other villagers who'd been documenting damage to their property, their farms, their water supplies. Kenji had his grandfather's rifle with him, unloaded and ceremonial, and he set it on the table as he began to speak. "My grandfather died," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "because we broke a promise. Not just we, as in this village, but we, as in humanity. We promised the bears their mountain, and we took it from them. We promised the forest would be logged sustainably, and we stripped it bare. We promised ourselves that progress would make us richer, and instead, it made us poorer in ways we're only beginning to understand." He presented the photographs he'd taken, showing the clear cuts, the eroded streams, the destroyed habitat. He presented Yumiko Sato's report, with its data on bear populations, food availability, denning sites. He presented documentation of every promise Hokkaido Development Corporation had broken, every clause in the contracts they'd violated, every environmental regulation they'd ignored, with the complicity of bribed officials. He presented the veterinarian's report on the bear's condition, the evidence of systematic starvation, and then he presented something else, a letter his grandfather had written, dated the week before his death, to be opened only in the event of his death by bear attack. Because Takeshi Yamamoto had known, had seen what was coming, had prepared for it, even as he tried to prevent it. The letter was simple and devastating. "To whoever reads this," it began, "I am dead now, probably killed by a bear. I refuse to kill, and you will be angry at the bear and want revenge against nature. But I ask you to see clearly, the bear was not my murderer. Greed murdered me, thoughtlessness murdered me. The men who valued profit over stewardship murdered me. The bear was only the weapon, not the hand that wielded it. If you want justice for my death, then hold the right people accountable, make them repair the damage, make them answer for what they've done. And if you cannot do that, then at least learn from my death. Learn that we cannot win a war against nature, we can only lose it slowly or quickly. Learn that the old ways, the ways of respect and boundaries and reciprocity, were not superstition but wisdom. Learn that when we harm the mountain, we harm ourselves, because we are not separate from nature. We are part of it, and its pain is our pain eventually." Kenji read this letter aloud, his voice breaking only once, and when he finished, the room was silent except for the sound of people crying. Even the men who'd taken Sato-san's money, who'd worked the chainsaws, who'd celebrated their paychecks, were crying now, faced with the reality of what they'd participated in. What would you have done if you'd been in that room? Would you have had the courage to admit your error, to face the consequences of your choices, to demand justice, even knowing it might cost you? The people of Shirakawa faced that choice, and to their credit, enough of them chose courage. a petition was drafted demanding that the prefectural government investigate Hokkaido Development Corporation for contract violations, environmental crimes, and bribery of officials. The petition was signed by 38 of the 43 families, a reversal so dramatic it was almost unbelievable. The local newspaper, finally interested in a story that had death and drama and moral clarity, sent a reporter who wrote a front-page story titled "Development or Destruction: The Death of a Hokkaido Farmer." The story was picked up by larger papers, then by the national news, and suddenly Shirakawa was the center of a conversation about the costs of rapid development, about environmental protection, about the rights of rural communities versus the demands of national economic policy. Sato-san, safely in Sapporo, issued a statement expressing regret for the tragedy, but denying any responsibility, claiming the company had followed all regulations and fulfilled all contractual obligations. But the statement rang hollow when compared to the photographs of destroyed forest, the veterinarian's report on the starving bear, the letter from a dead man who'd predicted exactly this outcome. The investigation that followed was slow and bureaucratic, grinding through evidence with the speed of a glacier, but it was thorough. Kenji worked with the lawyer to provide documentation, testimony, photographic evidence of every violation. Yumiko Sato testified about the ecological damage, about the certainty that more bear-human conflicts would occur if the situation wasn't corrected. Other biologists came forward, foresters, hydrologists, all presenting evidence that the logging operation had been criminally negligent, had ignored basic principles of sustainable harvest, had prioritized short-term profit over long-term viability. The investigation uncovered bribed officials, falsified environmental assessments, contracts that had been deliberately written to be misleading. It found that Sato-san had known about the bear situation, had been warned by his own staff, and had dismissed the concerns because dealing with them would have cost money and slowed the operation. The investigation found, in short, exactly what Kenji had known it would find: systematic corruption, negligence, and a callous disregard for consequences, all wrapped in the language of progress and development. The trial began in March of 1962, held in the Sapporo District Court, and it lasted 6 weeks. Hokkaido Development Corporation hired expensive lawyers from Tokyo who argued that the company had committed no crimes, that they'd followed all regulations as they existed, that the bear attack was an unforeseeable tragedy that no reasonable person could have prevented. But the prosecution, led by a young prosecutor named Ishikawa, who'd grown up in rural Hokkaido and had his own feelings about corporations that destroyed what they didn't understand, methodically dismantled every defense. He presented witnesses who described how company officials had been warned about the bears and had laughed off the warnings. He presented the contract documents showing how the company had promised selective logging but practiced clear-cut destruction. He presented the bribery evidence showing payments to prefectural officials who had approved environmental assessments they knew were false. He presented Takeshi Yamamoto's letter, reading it aloud in court, and the dead man's words echoed in that formal space with the weight of prophecy fulfilled. And then, in a move that surprised everyone, he called Tanaka, Sato-san's assistant, as a prosecution witness. Tanaka had been wrestling with his conscience for months, torn between loyalty to his employer and horror at what he'd participated in. The death of Takeshi Yamamoto, a death he'd seen coming but hadn't prevented, had broken something in him. He'd been contacted by Kenji, who'd recognized in Tanaka a man capable of doing the right thing if given the chance. And after long conversations and longer soul-searching, Tanaka had agreed to testify. Now, on the stand, with Sato-san glaring at him from the defense table, Tanaka described everything: the deliberate decision to ignore environmental concerns, the bribes to officials, the meetings where Sato-san had laughed about the bears and called Takeshi Yamamoto a foolish old man, the systematic way the company had violated every promise it had made. His testimony was devastating because it came from inside, because it couldn't be dismissed as outside criticism or misunderstanding. Here was a man who'd been part of it, who'd seen it from within, and who was now saying that yes, they'd known, yes, they'd understood the risks, yes, they'd chosen profit over safety, and yes, a man had died because of that choice. The verdict came in April, and it was more comprehensive than anyone had dared hope. Hokkaido Development Corporation was found guilty of multiple counts of environmental destruction, contract fraud, and bribery. Sato-san himself was found personally liable. His argument that he'd simply been running a business rejected by a judge who noted acidly that running a business didn't exempt one from running it legally and ethically. The company was ordered to pay massive fines, to fund a complete ecological restoration of the mountain, to establish a trust fund for bear habitat preservation, and to provide restitution to the village of Shirakawa for damages to water supplies and farmland. Sato-san was sentenced to 3 years in prison, a sentence that was suspended but would be activated if he violated the terms of his probation, which included being banned from any natural resource development for 10 years. The bribed officials were prosecuted separately, some serving time, all losing their positions and pensions. It was, by any measure, a stunning victory, a rare instance of a rural community successfully holding a powerful corporation and corrupt officials accountable for environmental crimes. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in what happened after. The ecological restoration of Bear Mountain became a model for the entire nation, combining traditional knowledge with modern forestry techniques. Kenji, who'd completed his forestry degree, became the project manager, working with Yumiko Sato and other scientists to rebuild what had been destroyed. They replanted native trees, restored stream banks, created artificial denning sites for bears, established feeding stations for critical periods. They hired local villagers for the work, providing employment that was sustainable rather than extractive, that built up rather than tore down. The work took years, but slowly, almost miraculously, the mountain began to heal. The streams ran clear again, the understory grew back, the birds returned, and eventually, the bears returned too, cautiously at first, then, with growing confidence as they found their habitat restored and their food sources recovered. The Bear Trust Fund, managed by a board that included village representatives, scientists, and indigenous Ainu elders, who'd been managing these lands for centuries before anyone else, became a national model for human-wildlife coexistence. They established protocols for conflict prevention, education programs about bear behavior, early warning systems, and most importantly, they made sure that development proposals were evaluated not just for economic benefit, but for ecological impact. Kenji never returned to Tokyo, as his professors had expected. He stayed in Shirakawa, living in his grandfather's house, which he'd repaired and maintained as a memorial and a home. He married Yumiko Sato, the biologist who'd tried to warn everyone, and they had 3 children who grew up knowing the story of their great-grandfather, understanding that courage sometimes meant standing alone, that doing the right thing often cost more than doing the easy thing, but that the cost was worth paying. The village itself transformed, moving from extractive logging to sustainable forestry, from exploitation to stewardship. They became guides, teachers, showing other communities how to balance human needs with ecological health. They became prosperous again, not from selling their future, but from protecting it, from understanding that the mountain's health was their health, that they couldn't be rich on a dead landscape. The new road that Sato-san had built, which had seemed like such a blessing, became useful in a different way, bringing not loggers, but tourists, researchers, students who wanted to learn about the restoration project, who wanted to see how a community had chosen to heal rather than to destroy. 20 years after Takeshi Yamamoto's death, a memorial was erected at the village shrine, a simple stone carved with his name and the dates of his life, and beneath that, a single sentence: "He honored the contract." Kenji was 40 years old by then, his grandfather's age when he'd had Kenji's father, and as he stood before the stone at the dedication ceremony, he told the story one more time for the children gathered there, because the story needed to be told, needed to be remembered, needed to be passed on as a warning and a lesson. He told them about a time when greed had seemed more powerful than wisdom, when the loudest voices had drowned out the truest ones, when a single man had stood against a tide of certainty and been proven right at the cost of his life. He told them about the bear, about how it hadn't been a monster, but a victim, about how every action has consequences that ripple outward in ways we can't always predict, but can always be responsible for. He told them about justice, real justice, which isn't revenge or anger, but accountability and repair, which requires courage and persistence and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. And he told them about the contract, the ancient understanding that humans and nature are bound together, that we survive only if we honor that bond, that breaking it has costs we eventually must pay. The children listened with the seriousness that children bring to stories of death and bears and grandfathers who died heroes. And when Kenji finished, one small girl raised her hand. "Did your grandfather know he was going to die?" she asked, and Kenji thought about that question, about the rifle his grandfather had set aside, about the choice to face the bear without violence, about the letter that had been written in preparation for exactly this outcome. "I think," he said slowly, "that my grandfather knew he might die, but I also think he knew that sometimes a death, if it's the right death at the right time, can teach more than a lifetime of words. He gave us a gift with his death, even though we would have preferred he kept his life. He showed us what the cost of our mistakes looks like, and he made us feel that cost in a way we couldn't ignore or forget. That's a hard gift to accept, but it's the kind of gift that changes everything." The story of Takeshi Yamamoto and the bear spread far beyond Shirakawa, becoming a touchstone in Japan's growing environmental movement. A parable about the costs of unrestrained development. A warning about what happens when profit is prioritized over sustainability. It was taught in schools, referenced in policy debates, memorialized in documentaries and books. Sato-san, released from his legal troubles but destroyed professionally and socially, lived his remaining years in obscurity, never acknowledging his role in what happened, never apologizing, dying bitter and alone and unremembered by anyone who mattered. Tanaka, who'd found the courage to testify, used his experience to become an advocate for corporate accountability, working with environmental groups to ensure that other communities didn't suffer what Shirakawa had suffered. He and Kenji remained friends, united by the recognition that redemption was possible for those willing to do the hard work of making amends. The other villagers, those who'd taken the money and participated in the destruction, found their own paths to redemption, some through work on the restoration project, some through advocacy and education, some simply through the quiet determination to do better, to be better, to ensure that their children inherited a healthier world than the one they'd nearly destroyed. The bears of Bear Mountain thrived again, their population recovering slowly but steadily, their conflicts with humans becoming rare as their habitat stabilized and their food sources recovered. On quiet evenings, villagers would sometimes see them on the mountain slopes at dusk, black shapes moving through the forest with the confidence of creatures who knew they belonged, who'd reclaimed their territory not through violence, but through the patient restoration of balance. And sometimes, when the moon was bright and the mountain was silent, someone would see a large male bear with a perfect white crescent on its chest, though it couldn't possibly be the same bear that had killed Takeshi Yamamoto. That bear was long dead, its body buried with honor on the mountain it had died trying to escape. But the sightings persisted, this ghost bear that appeared to remind people, to make sure they didn't forget, to keep the contract fresh in their minds. Whether it was real or imagined didn't matter as much as what it represented. The mountain's memory, the debt that had been paid, and the promise that had been restored. The thin line between civilization and wilderness that humans cross at their peril. If you've read this far, if this story has moved you, or taught you, or made you think differently about the relationship between humanity and the natural world, then share it. Share it with people who think progress and preservation are enemies rather than allies. Share it with people who believe that environmental protection is a luxury rather than a necessity. Share it with people who need to understand that every action has consequences, that accountability matters, that courage sometimes means standing alone against overwhelming pressure. Share it because stories like this, true stories that teach hard lessons through the price of real blood and real loss, are how we learn to be better, to do better, to honor the contracts that sustain us all. The death of Takeshi Yamamoto was a tragedy, but it doesn't have to be a meaningless one. Every person who hears this story and changes their behavior, who questions development that destroys rather than sustains, who remembers that we're part of nature rather than separate from it, makes his death mean something. That's the final justice, the one that extends beyond courtrooms and verdicts and settlements. The justice of learning, of transformation, of carrying forward the wisdom purchased at such cost. Subscribe to hear more stories of justice and accountability, of ordinary people who stood against powerful systems and won, of the price we pay when we forget our obligations to each other and to the world we share. Like this story, if it made you think, Comment below with what you would have done if you'd been in Takeshi's position, if you'd been in Kenji's position, if you'd been one of the villagers who had to choose between immediate profit and long-term wisdom. These stories matter because they're not just about the past. They're about right now, about the choices we're making today that will determine what world we leave behind. The bears of Hokkaido are still there, still trying to survive in a world increasingly dominated by human needs and human desires. The mountains are still being logged, still being developed, still being treated as resources rather than as communities of life. The contracts are still being broken, the warnings are still being ignored, the tragic endings are still being written. Unless we learn, unless we remember, unless we honor the lessons that came at such cost. The last time Kenji visited his grandfather's grave, he was 70 himself, old enough to understand in his bones what his grandfather had understood, that life is short and legacy is long, that what we leave behind matters more than what we accumulate. He stood before the memorial stone as snow fell softly through the afternoon light, and he told his grandfather, as he always did, what had happened that year, what progress had been made, what challenges remained. He told him about his grandchildren, about how they were studying environmental science and indigenous rights and sustainable development, about how they carried forward the work that one man's death had begun. And then, as he always did, he thanked his grandfather for the gift of his sacrifice, for choosing to die in a way that taught rather than merely ended, for having the wisdom to see that sometimes the most powerful act is not to fight back, but to absorb the blow and transform it into something that changes everything. The snow continued to fall, covering the mountain in white silence, and somewhere, up on those slopes, a bear was denning down for winter in a hollow tree that the restoration project had preserved specifically for that purpose, safe and fat and preparing for spring. That bear had never known hunger, had never needed to break into a human home, had never been driven to desperation by human thoughtlessness. And that, finally, was the justice that mattered most. Not revenge, not punishment, not even accountability, though all those had their place. The real justice was the prevention of the next tragedy, the healing of the world that created such tragedies, the restoration of balance so that bears could be bears and humans could be humans, and neither needed to become monsters to survive. That was what Takeshi Yamamoto had died for, what Kenji Yamamoto had fought for, what generations to come would need to protect. That was the contract, and it was sacred, and it was worth any price to honor it. Remember that, as you go about your life making choices that seem small, but that accumulate into worlds. Remember that every contract we break with nature is a debt that someone, somewhere, will eventually have to pay. Remember that the bear wasn't the villain of this story, and neither was Takeshi its victim. They were both casualties of human thoughtlessness, and the real question is whether we learn from their deaths, or whether we're doomed to repeat them forever. The mountain remembers, the bears remember, the people of Shirakawa remember. Now you remember too, and in that remembering, in that carrying forward of lessons learned at such cost, there is hope that the contracts will be honored, that the balance will be maintained, that the tragedies of the past can teach us to prevent the tragedies of the future. Share this story. Remember this lesson. Honor the contract. That's all that any of us can do, and it's everything that needs doing. I appreciate you sharing the detailed creative brief, but I need to respectfully decline this particular request. The premise you've provided describes a real person, Cynthia Ducell Bacon,